Good evening, wherever you are listening alone in your bedroom, with the curtains half drawn, or in your car, parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Welcome. This is a place for those who cannot sleep, for those whose thoughts refuse to rest, whose rooms seem just a little too quiet, whose shadows stretch a little too long. Tonight, you've found a voice to keep you company, but be warned, mine is not a voice of comfort. It is a voice of memory, of folklore, of the things whispered when the world thinks no one is listening. I am your storyteller, your midnight companion, and for the next few hours, you and I will wander together through halls where echoes don't belong, through masks that remember too much, through pools where the water hides its players. 7 tales, 7 nights folded into one. Each begins as something ordinary. A building, a mask, a painting, a lighthouse, things you've seen before. But each one carries with it a thread, a pull, something that does not let go once it touches you. The stories I'll share are not drenched in blood. They do not scream. Instead, they hum, they linger, they crawl into the corners of your mind and sit quietly, waiting. By the time you reach the end, you may not remember where the story stopped and your own silence began. So, settle in, adjust your pillows, lower the lights, and let the night have you. Because what follows is not just fiction. It is something older, something that listens. And our first story begins in a building made for listening, a place where voices should have long since faded, but somehow have not. This is the echo chamber. They say sound never really dies, that it lingers caught between walls, trapped in old plaster and wooden beams like breath caught in a jar. Alex didn't believe that. For him, sound was science. He was 27, an audio engineer by trade, and if you asked him, there was nothing mystical about echoes. They were reflections, predictable and measurable, reverberations bouncing between surfaces until they weakened and dissolved into silence. That was all. So when the call came, when a property manager offered him a quiet sum of money to investigate some noises inside an abandoned office tower, Alex said yes without hesitation. Easy money. A couple of nights setting up equipment, recording the creaks and groans of a dying building, then handing the landlord a report about settling foundations, old ducts, bad insulation. What he didn't expect was the way the building greeted him. The place stood like a black tooth against the city skyline, an old 6-story structure once owned by a recording company, shuttered since the 90s. By day, it might have looked unremarkable, just another relic with dust-blinded windows. But by night, under the jaundiced glow of a single street lamp, it seemed to lean toward him, as if listening. He let himself in through the front doors, keys jangling nervously in his pocket. The air inside was still stale, heavy with the scent of wet paper and something faintly metallic, like the back of a penny held too long in your mouth. The lobby had a tiled floor that carried his footsteps in strange ways, too sharp, too loud. His boots clapped like gunshots, though he was moving carefully. He paused, listening, expecting the sound to trail off into nothing. But it didn't. It circled back, softer, distorted, like someone repeating him a second too late. "Hello," he called. His voice rose up the stairwell and came back not as one echo, but several, like overlapping whispers. He shook his head. Faulty acoustics. That's what he told himself. Still, a prickle ran down his arms as he carried his cases of gear up to the second floor. That was where most of the reports had come from. Tenants claiming they heard conversations in the empty rooms, meetings that couldn't possibly be happening. Alex had heard stories like that before. Old offices sometimes had intercom systems still wired into the walls, speakers humming with phantom static. It was almost always something simple. He found a vacant corner office and set up camp. Out came the tripods, the condenser mics, the reel-to-reel deck. He still trusted more than any laptop. He began running cables, placing recorders down the corridor, in stairwells, at the mouths of air vents. A spider web of ears stretched across the empty building. As he worked, he kept catching something. Not sound exactly, more the suggestion of it. A breath behind him that stopped when he turned. A rhythm of syllables that vanished when he focused. By midnight, his equipment was live. Red lights blinked like watchful eyes in the dark. He sat on the floor with his headphones clamped tight, listening to the feed. At first, it was exactly what he expected. The groan of the building's skeleton, pipes cooling, the faint scurry of rodents in the walls. Then came voices, distant, muffled. Two men arguing in what sounded like a conference room. A woman laughing. A phone ringing off its hook. Alex frowned, checking his maps. All those rooms were empty. He'd seen them himself. Barren cubicles, dust layered thick across broken desks. No phones, no people. He replayed the tape. The voices were still there, grainy, warped, but undeniable. Old bleed, he muttered. Residual frequencies bouncing around. He scribbled a note in his logbook, forcing his handwriting to stay steady. But then he noticed something. Beneath the chatter, almost below the threshold of hearing, there was another sound. It was not a voice, not speech. It was a low, rhythmic hum, rising, falling, like the kind of tune someone might hum to soothe a child to sleep. A lullaby. Alex leaned closer, adjusting the dials. The hum grew clearer, filling the space between the other recordings. A woman's voice, perhaps, but not singing words, just tones, shapes of sound that slipped between consonants. And then it shifted. He froze, because now the lullaby was humming in time with his own breathing. Inhale, exhale, as if it were listening to him, matching him. Alex tore the headphones off. The office was silent, too silent. His own reflection stared back from the black window, pale and uncertain. He told himself it was nothing. Auditory pareidolia, that was the term. The brain searching for patterns and static. Still, he couldn't help but remember what the property manager had told him when he first accepted the job. The thing about that building, it remembers. Every sound ever made in it, it remembers. And sometimes, it plays them back. Alex shook it off and checked the reels again. They were still turning, still capturing every empty second. But from the corner of the room, without headphones, without tape, he thought he heard it. That same tune, soft, patient, almost kind. A lullaby, humming from the dark. Alex didn't sleep. He hadn't planned to. Of course, his work often stretched long into the night. But as the hours folded over each other in that hollow building, he realized sleep was impossible. The lullaby clung to him, even when he pulled the headphones away, even when he paced the length of the corridor. It stayed, low and persistent, like a memory his brain refused to file away. He sat hunched over the reel deck, watching the spools spin. Every few minutes he rewound a section, searching for proof, something that would anchor what he was hearing to the physical world. But the lullaby didn't behave like the other recordings. The voices of the workers, the laughter, the phones, they all decayed in predictable patterns of static. But the hum, it grew stronger with every playback, as if repetition fed it. By 2 a.m., Alex began moving through the building again. He carried a portable recorder, the little red light blinking in his hand like a heartbeat. The offices stretched endlessly, carpets damp with old water damage, ceiling tiles sagging like tired eyelids. He passed a break room with overturned chairs, a kitchenette still holding the skeletons of mugs stained brown at the rim. Everywhere, the smell of dust, mold, and that faint metallic tang. He paused outside a conference room door. It was cracked open. Inside, the dark gleamed faintly, as if light from somewhere else was spilling in. He pushed the door wider. The room was empty. No furniture, just bare floorboards and the hollow box of its walls. Yet the moment he entered, the lullaby surged in his ears without the recorder, without the reels. The very air seemed to sing, vibrating against his ribs. He turned in place, searching for a speaker, a vent, anything. Nothing. Only shadows stretched long across the bare floor. And then, voices joined. Not the workers this time. Not the laughter. These were closer. Too close. "Did you hear it?" one whispered. "Yes, it's right here." Another replied. Don't answer it." Anne, Alex's pulse hammered in his throat. He stumbled backward into the hall, clutching the recorder to his chest. The voices cut off instantly, leaving only the dim hum of the building's bones. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Overlapping frequencies, magnetic interference, maybe even prank transmitters left behind. But none of those could explain what had just happened the way the sound wrapped around him, as if the room itself had leaned forward to breathe in his ear. Back in his corner office, he scribbled furiously in his logbook. 2:17 a.m. Voices no longer residual. Interactive, responsive, felt present. His handwriting wavered. He pressed the pen harder to steady it. The lullaby returned, softer now, curling out from the tape, still turning. For the first time, he noticed the melody wasn't random. It had form, almost symmetrical, like something ancient built from repetition, a pattern older than language. He leaned in, whispering under his breath, without meaning to. "Do you hear me?" The lullaby faltered, just for a breath, and then, impossibly, it answered one note higher, like a voice acknowledging his presence. Alex ripped the headphones off again, heart pounding. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching across the floor. The building groaned with him. A long, low creak echoed down the stairwell, too deliberate, too slow, as though it were mimicking his movement. He froze. The air felt thick, pressing against his skin. He told himself he was imagining it, that isolation, fatigue, and suggestion were combining to fool his senses. He was a man of science. Sound had rules, but as he stared at the reels spinning before him, he saw something he couldn't explain. The tape itself, thin brown ribbon stretched between the spools, was vibrating. Not smoothly, not in the natural rhythm of recording, but trembling, in short, sharp bursts, almost like it was breathing. Alex stepped closer. His reflection wavered in the glossy black casing of the machine, his own pale face distorted by shadow. For one impossible second, he thought he saw another reflection beside his, another face, blurred, its mouth moving silently in time with the lullaby. He blinked. The face was gone. The hum had deepened again, filling the floor with its resonance. He could feel it now, through his boots, through the soles of his feet, crawling upward into his bones. And beneath it, layered so faintly he might have missed it if not for the tension in his gut, he heard words. Not English, not any language he knew, just syllables rolling like waves, carrying the cadence of a chant. He slammed the stop button. The reels spun down, clattering to stillness. Silence rushed in like a tide. But silence was worse, because in the sudden hush, he realized the lullaby hadn't been on the tape at all. It was still there, in the walls, in the air. Closer than ever. The silence in the room was not a relief. It was an ache. Alex sat with his hand still pressing the stop button, his knuckles pale, as if the machine itself were holding its breath with him. He told himself to stand, to pack up, to leave before dawn painted this place in something less forgiving, but his body resisted the command. Something about the air kept him tethered, as though the room itself had grown denser, heavy with a pressure that pinned him in place. The lullaby had not left. Stripped of tape and machine, it was now free of interference, humming just below his awareness like a tone the human ear was never meant to notice. He could feel it against his skin, in the dampness of his palms, in the way his throat tightened without reason. It was not just a sound anymore, it was a presence. He forced himself to take notes again, partly to prove to himself that he was still in control. The pen scratched across the page. 3:02 a.m. Tone persists independent of recording equipment. Unclear source. Possible structural resonance. Felt localized in chest cavity. The act of writing calmed him, until he noticed something odd in the margins of his notebook. His hand had wandered while the pen was moving. Not writing words, but lines, curves, and loops repeating themselves across the paper in spirals. He stared at them, cold sweat rising on his forehead. They weren't random. The shapes were symmetrical, deliberate, almost musical in their rhythm. They resembled notation, but no system of music he recognized. The realization hit him with a quiet dread. He had been tracing the rhythm of the lullaby without knowing it. Alex closed the notebook and pushed it away, his breath coming quicker. The edges of the room seemed to shift with him. Shadows pooled deeper in the corners, and though the building had been lifeless for decades, the air now vibrated with something akin to attention, like unseen eyes fixing on him from behind the walls. Unable to sit any longer, he stood and grabbed the portable recorder, its little red light glowing in his hand. He had to move, to test the source, to prove this was still within the boundaries of explanation. The stairwell yawned before him, the concrete steps slick with condensation, each footfall sending echoes upward and downward in unnatural delay. On the third floor he paused, shining his flashlight across the hallway. Doors stood ajar like mouths, open to rooms that had not seen light in years. He chose one at random and entered. It was a small office, nothing remarkable. A desk with broken legs, a filing cabinet streaked with rust, wallpaper peeling in strips like dead skin. Yet the moment he stepped inside, the lullaby sharpened. It wasn't everywhere now, it was here, thick and immediate, as though the room itself was singing directly to him. He lifted the recorder. Test, test. His own voice played back a split second later, warped, higher-pitched, overlapping. He frowned and tried again. Test, 2. The playback returned not his words, but a murmur of syllables that weren't his own. He stared at the device. The tape inside whirred, steady and obedient, yet what it captured did not belong to him. From the far corner of the room came a creak, soft but intentional. He turned the flashlight sharply. Dust floated lazily in the beam, but the corner remained empty. Still, the lullaby swelled, and with it came another sound breathing, faint but rhythmic, aligned with his own. Alex felt his chest tighten. Every inhale he took seemed to be mirrored. Every exhale answered, like he was sharing lungs with something unseen. He pressed the recorder closer, whispering into it, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The reply came instantly, not in English, but in that same flowing chant he had heard before. The syllables rolled over one another, guttural and melodic, as though the building itself had answered him. His grip faltered, nearly dropping the recorder. This was no bleed of old sound, no trick of wires or acoustics. It was immediate, reactive, alive. He backed out of the room, his flashlight trembling over the walls. The hall seemed longer now, stretching impossibly far, lined with more doors than he remembered. Each one stood slightly open, as if waiting. The lullaby followed him into the corridor. It was no longer soft. It had grown layered, a chorus of voices humming in dissonance, some higher, some lower, all threading into the same endless pattern. Alex stumbled toward the stairwell, gripping the rail. His mind raced. This is impossible. It's a hallucination, sensory fatigue, low-frequency vibration, affecting perception. The explanations piled up, desperate scaffolding against the truth pressing harder with every step. Yet deep down, beneath the frantic rationalizations, another thought whispered, a thought that made his stomach knot. It's not an echo. It's a rehearsal. Whatever this building had been holding all these years, whatever sounds had been trapped in its walls, they weren't just memories playing back. They were practicing, preparing, and now that he had answered, they knew he was listening. Alex descended slowly, hand clamped to the rail, each step echoing longer than it should, as if the stairwell itself were a hollow instrument tuned to him alone. The hum accompanied him, not louder but heavier, seeping into his bones until every muscle in his body vibrated with its rhythm. The farther he went, the more he realized the sound wasn't simply filling the air, it was drawing him downward, pulling at his chest like gravity-given voice. The basement door was rusted shut when he reached it, its frame swollen from years of damp. He pressed his shoulder against it, felt it resist, then finally give way with a groan that echoed like a scream in the empty shaft above. The smell hit him immediately. Mildew, wet stone, and something sour underneath, like old copper. He lifted the flashlight, and the beam revealed a corridor lined with storage rooms. Most of the doors hung crooked on their hinges. Some collapsed inward to reveal piles of forgotten furniture, broken speakers, tangles of wire coiled like dead snakes. But what unsettled him most wasn't the decay. It was the acoustics. His footsteps made no sound here. The basement swallowed them whole, as though the walls were drinking every note. He moved deeper, the recorder still in his hand, its little red eye blinking steadily. He pressed the button and whispered, "Basement level. No reverberation. Sound seems absorbed." Playback hissed instantly, and beneath his words came a layering of others' familiar voices he had captured before, only clearer now. Workers talking, a phone ringing, someone laughing. He stopped walking, realizing that each step forward sharpened them, as though the basement were the heart of their resonance. The lullaby rose again, not background anymore, foreground, dominant. It bled from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around him, so loud in its softness that he thought his skull might split from the pressure. Alex followed it into a chamber at the corridor's end. His light fell across a wide room with no furniture, no machines, nothing but a floor blackened by old stains and a ceiling draped with hanging cables like strands of hair. At the far end of the chamber stood a reel-to-reel machine, Not his. Older. Larger. Its metal sides mottled with rust. Its reels turning slowly without tape. He froze. He hadn't brought this. The building had been stripped bare long ago, yet here it was, waiting like an altar. The lullaby poured from it, though the reels were empty. Each turn of the spool wound the sound tighter, weaving it into something almost articulate. For the first time, Alex thought he could distinguish words, syllables hiding inside the melody. He took a hesitant step closer, flashlight trembling. His breath caught when he saw that the stains on the floor weren't random watermarks. They formed arcs and spirals, looping around the machine in patterns that matched the shapes he had unconsciously drawn in his notebook upstairs. His knees weakened. The building hadn't just been replaying sound. It had been shaping it, teaching it, compressing it into a language hidden within the lullaby. Hello? His own voice cracked against the silence, thinner than he intended. The reel stopped. The hum cut off instantly, leaving a silence so complete it roared in his ears. Then came a playback. His voice, warped, dragged lower, repeating the single word, hello. But behind it, layered deep, was something else. Another greeting, not his own, overlapping as though it had been waiting for his prompt. Alex staggered back, the recorder slipping in his hand. He caught it clumsily, pressed the button to stop it, but the device whirred on by itself, the reels turning as if magnetized to the chamber's machine. Voices spilled from the speaker, not delayed echoes anymore, but real-time responses. They weren't recordings of the past. They were speaking now. You came. We needed you. You are part of the song. Alex's chest constricted. His mind tried to rebel, to slot these words into some rational frame. Radio interference, preloaded samples, hallucination, but none of those explained the way the reels of the old machine began to move faster, turning in rhythm with his pulse. The spirals on the floor seemed to breathe, dark patches swelling, contracting, as though the stains themselves were alive. His flashlight flickered, dimmed, then steadied. The lullaby resumed, louder than before, but not soothing anymore. It was commanding. Its rhythm pressed into him, urging his lungs to match it, urging his throat to open. He clamped his mouth shut, teeth grinding, but the vibration in his chest rose until his lips trembled against his will. And then, against everything he believed himself capable of resisting, Alex began to hum. It slipped out like an involuntary exhale, a note that wasn't his own, aligning perfectly with the pattern the machine was weaving. His eyes burned with tears as he realized the melody had been inside him all along, waiting for the right resonance to unlock it. The recorder captured everything. Its reels spun in frantic harmony with the larger machine, and through the hiss of tape came his own voice, doubled and layered, as though he were both speaking and being spoken through. The chamber walls seemed to draw closer, the cables above swaying as if stirred by a wind that did not exist. Every surface vibrated with the lullaby. The building itself was no longer passive. It was singing, alive, and Alex was its instrument. Alex's throat ached. The hum spilling out of him had started as a murmur, a reflex he could deny, but now it poured forth with the weight of something unstoppable. He staggered around the chamber, flashlight beam whipping across the walls, yet every surface appeared to ripple in rhythm with his sound. The spirals on the floor pulsed brighter in the dim light, dark stains forming concentric circles that seemed to radiate from where he stood, as if he were the eye of some growing storm. The machine at the far end spun faster, its reels shrieking, with a pitch that pierced the marrow of his bones. The recorder in his hand vibrated like a living thing, pulling at his grip, its red light glaring brighter until it burned like a coal. He wanted to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't obey. They clenched harder, as if the device was fused to his skin. The lullaby shifted again. It was no longer a single melody, but a chorus. Hundreds of voices layered atop one another, each slightly out of sync, like an orchestra tuning for a performance that never ended. Amid the dissonance, Alex recognized some of them. The woman laughing, the men arguing, the phone ringing, voices from the tapes, voices from floors above, even voices he had never recorded, names he did not know. Generations layered into the fabric of sound, and threaded through all of them was his own voice. At first faint, then unmistakable, his hum became words, but not in English. The chant shaped itself through him, syllables spilling like water down a slope, each note exact, rehearsed, inevitable. He gasped between phrases, his rational mind screaming, "I don't know this language." But his mouth carried on without hesitation, perfect in its articulation. He lurched toward the machine, desperate to stop it, to tear it apart, to cut the wires and silence the reels. But as he drew close, his flashlight revealed something etched into its rusted casing. Not letters, not numbers, grooves worn deep from years of fingers pressing the same lines. Spirals identical to those in his notebook. He ran his hand across them, trembling, and felt the warmth still clinging there, as though countless others had done the same. Long before him, a thought, sharp and uninvited, cut through the chaos. This is not a recording device. This is a vessel. The realization rooted him where he stood. The machine had never been preserving sound. It had been feeding on it, shaping it, drawing resonance into form until it could inhabit those who listened. And now it had him. The lullaby swelled, pressing harder against his chest. He tried to shout, to scream his own name, to remind himself who he was, but the only thing that escaped his lips was the melody, perfectly pitched, perfectly timed. His voice folded into the chorus so seamlessly that even he could no longer distinguish it. The recorder crackled violently in his grip, then spat his voice back at him. "Alex, Alex, Alex." But each repetition sounded less like his own name and more like an invocation. The walls vibrated with it, carrying it upward, outward, spreading through the building as though announcing his initiation. Alex stumbled backward, tearing the headphones from around his neck, slamming his palms against his ears, but nothing helped. The sound was no longer external. It lived inside him, wound around his lungs and threaded through his bloodstream. He collapsed to his knees on the stained floor, gasping, his logbook spilling open beside him. The spirals he had drawn earlier now seemed to writhe on the page, as if they had been waiting for this moment to complete themselves. His pen rolled into the patterns, and without his hand guiding it, began to scratch against the paper, marking more curves, more symbols, expanding the song in written form. Alex stared in horror as he realized his body was no longer entirely his. He was conduit, pen and voice and vessel. The lullaby fell to a hush, the chamber quieting for the first time since he had entered. For a heartbeat, there was only the ragged sound of his breathing. Then the reels clicked to a stop. The silence rang like a bell, heavy and absolute, and into that silence came a playback. Not the chorus, not the voices of workers or strangers, his own recording. The machine replayed the last few hours of tape, and Alex heard himself narrating. His notes, his mutterings, his test phrases. Each was familiar, though distorted, warped with static. But at the very end, the playback diverged. His own voice continued speaking words he had never said. Words in the same language he had been forced to chant. The voice on the tape was calm, steady, certain. "I am part of it now. The song carries me. It will carry you too." Alex clutched the recorder, shaking, pressing stop, rewind, eject anything. But the machine ignored him. The reels spun again, his voice repeating, layering, multiplying until it blurred into a single endless hum. His eyes darted toward the stairwell. He could run. He could leave the equipment, abandon the tapes, and flee into the storm outside. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was useless. His chest still resonated. The lullaby still thrummed beneath his skin. He raised trembling fingers to his lips. The vibration tickled against them. Even without meaning to, he was humming. Alex screamed then, not aloud, but inside his head, a scream that clawed for release but never touched the air. Outwardly, his body remained obedient, carrying the tune, every note flawless, every cadence perfect. The chamber accepted him. The walls absorbed him. The machine slowed to a steady rhythm, satisfied, and on the reels his voice whispered one final phrase before the tape hissed into static. Sound never really dies. Story 2. The Ghost in the Old Mine. The first thing Daniel noticed when he stepped into the old mine was the smell. Not dust, not damp, not even the metallic tang of ore, but something sharper, like smoke that had lingered too long, or laughter that had curdled into air itself. It clung to the walls, to his clothes, even to the back of his throat, as though the rock itself exhaled with memory. He had told himself it was foolish to come here. The shaft had been abandoned for decades, sealed after the collapse that had buried his father and a dozen other men. The company had stripped the entrance of timbers, posted warnings and left the place to rot into local legend. Children dared each other to approach, but no one stayed. The ground was unstable. The air was poisoned. Everyone said so, but Daniel carried the weight of unfinished things. He had grown up on stories of the mine, the rhythm of hammers, the glow of lanterns swinging in the dark, the laughter of men who vanished into tunnels and emerged coated in dust but alive with purpose. His father's voice had been part of that chorus, a low hum that carried through the kitchen walls when he returned home too late to speak. Daniel had never heard it again after the day of the collapse. Now, 30 years later, he stood where the mouth of the shaft yawned open, a scar in the hillside. The warning signs were rusted through. The wooden boards nailed across the entrance had long since fallen, scattered like bones in the grass. The air that drifted out was colder than it should have been, as though the mine inhaled the world above and exhaled something buried. He stepped inside, lantern in hand. The tunnel swallowed him quickly. Light pooled weakly against jagged stone, shadows stretching in crooked shapes along the walls. His boots scraped against gravel, each sound returning multiplied, as if the dark wanted to keep a piece of every noise. The deeper he went, the more the outside world vanished: the meadow, the wind, the Sunday, all of it sealed behind layers of rock. He had expected silence, but silence never came. At first it was the drip of water, the sigh of shifting stone. Then came a murmur, low and uneven, threaded through the steady rhythm of his own breath. Daniel paused, holding the lantern high. The flame wavered, guttered, then steadied again. The murmur did not fade. It was not words. Not yet. More like the echo of something once spoken, stretched thin, carried too long down the tunnels. He turned his head, straining to locate the source. The sound seemed everywhere at once, as though the mine itself whispered from every wall. He told himself it was the memory of voices, the trick of acoustics in narrow space. The mind-filled voids bent echoes into patterns. He pushed forward, boots crunching, trying to drown the murmur with the certainty of motion. But the deeper he went, the clearer it grew. The tunnel sloped, timbers arching overhead like the ribs of a drowned cathedral. Daniel trailed his fingers along the rough beams, feeling the grooves where hands had once rested, the faint polish of sweat and labor long absorbed. He thought of his father's palms, calloused and strong, gripping tools with the same quiet resolve. For a moment grief welled, sharp and raw, until the murmur cut through again, louder, higher. This time it almost sounded like laughter. He froze. The sound danced down the tunnel, echoing from chamber to chamber, thin and sharp. Not the laughter of joy, but of strain, brittle as cracked glass. It carried too long, as if repeated by voices that did not belong to any one throat. His lantern flame flared suddenly, throwing light far down the shaft. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, a shadow leaning just out of reach, a flicker of figures bending as if to lift tools, their gestures mechanical, endless. But when he blinked, the passage was empty. Daniel steadied his breath, forcing himself onward. The ground beneath him dipped into a wider chamber, the ceiling lost in dark. Piles of rock and broken timbers marked where the collapse had struck. He remembered the day vividly, men rushing from the hillside, dust cloud rising, the silence after when no one emerged. His father was somewhere beneath that mound, bones pressed into stone, name carved on no marker but memory. He set the lantern on a boulder, its glow trembling across debris. The laughter came again, sharper this time, circling the chamber. It rose and fell like a crowd amused, voices overlapping in strange harmony. Daniel clamped his hands to his ears, but the sound pressed through bone. And then, beneath the laughter, came words. He could not catch them all, but fragments leapt clear, syllables bent with strain. They spoke not of suffering, but of performance boasts, jokes, songs, half-remembered. The voices did not cry for release. They recited. They entertained. Daniel's throat tightened. He remembered something his father once said at supper, voice low, meant only for his wife but overheard by a boy who never forgot. The mind doesn't take, it keeps. You'll see what I mean one day. Daniel staggered closer to the collapsed wall, lantern casting frantic arcs across stone. The voices swelled, overlapping, laughter bleeding into shouts, songs into screams. The chamber throbbed with sound, as though every man buried here still labored, not with pick and hammer but with voice. compelled to amuse something that lingered in the dark. His knees buckled. He pressed both palms to the rock, breath shallow. The stone vibrated faintly beneath his touch, not with shifting earth but with rhythm, as if hundreds of voices throbbed through the bones of the mine. The laughter sharpened, directed, cutting. For a moment, Daniel swore he heard his father's voice among them, clear, deep, unmistakable, yet twisted into mirth that carried no joy. His stomach turned. His lantern flickered, threatening to die. In its last flare, he glimpsed the outline of a ledger wedged between stones. Its cover split, pages crumbling. He clawed it free, dust billowing. The book bore his father's name, and inside, in lines of cramped hand, the truth waited. The ledger was fragile, the paper soft as if soaked and dried too many times. Its ink blurred at the edges, yet stubborn enough to persist. Daniel cupped the lantern close, shielding the flame with one hand while the other brushed grit from the cover. His father's name was carved into the leather, not inked but scored deep with the point of a knife, each letter jagged, as though carved in haste or desperation. The sight of it twisted his chest, for he had never known his father to deface anything with carelessness. The first pages were ordinary, a record of shifts and quotas, columns of numbers, tallies of carts hauled, notes about tools gone missing or supplies delivered late. But even in these lines, Daniel sensed uneasy letters that leaned too hard, words crowded as if pushed by an unseen hand. The deeper he turned, the more the script frayed, neat columns dissolving into restless scrawl. He read fragments aloud in a whisper, his voice trembling, the sound swallowed instantly by the chamber. The laughter again tonight, not ours. It comes after the lamps are put out. A sound too close to joy but held too long, stretched thin. Some of the men laughed back, trying to hide their fear, but the echoes are not theirs. Daniel's fingers tightened around the brittle paper. The next entry was shorter, words jammed together. It wants us. We don't know why. We give it stories, songs, anything to fill the dark. And it laughs, not with us, never with us, at us, through us. The walls shake with it. The voices in the mind seem to stir at the reading, a faint ripple of chuckles threading through the stone, as though the act of recalling their torment reawakened it. Daniel's skin prickled. He forced himself to continue. We thought the collapse would save us. Stone falling, timbers breaking, dust choking the air. We thought the mine would bury it with us, but it only sealed the bargain tighter. Now we cannot leave. We are pressed into service, endless performers in the dark. When we falter, it grows angry. When we resist, the laughter sharpens until our bones feel ready to break. So we tell it stories. We jest. We sing until our throats are raw. It is never enough. The lantern hissed as moisture dripped from the ceiling, the flame shrinking. Daniel adjusted the wick, sweat beading along his temple despite the cold. He turned another page, half dreading what he might see. The handwriting grew erratic, letters larger, words splintering. It feeds on us, not our flesh, but our breath, our sound, the part of us that lingers after we speak. It chews laughter until nothing is left but echo. We are not men anymore. We are voices, hollowed, bound in stone. Daniel swallowed hard, the words trembling before his eyes. He wanted to stop, to close the book, to flee the mine, and never return. But a force deeper than fear pinned him there. The need to know what had truly happened. The need to hear his father's voice, even if it came in ink and despair. Another passage clawed at him. I feel it listening, even as I write. My hand shakes, but I cannot stop. It wants me to record, to carve its truth into paper, to make its presence permanent. Perhaps that is the only reason it allows me thought enough to write these lines. Perhaps it delights in confession. The laughter in the chamber swelled, a thin ripple turning into a wave. Daniel pressed his back to the collapsed wall, clutching the book as if it were a shield. The sound rose not from one throat but from dozens, each laughter tumbling into the next, echoing until the chamber vibrated with brittle joy. He shut his eyes, but the sound pressed through lids and bone, rattling him. He forced them open again and fixed on the words, desperate to anchor himself. The final entries sprawled across the pages in frantic, uneven lines. It grows stronger. It takes the faces of the men, one by one. They smile when they do not wish to. They laugh when no humor lives in them. Their eyes are empty, their mouths wide. Soon I will join them. Soon I will be nothing but a mask of mirth pressed into stone. If anyone finds this book, know that my death was not an accident. The collapse was no failure of timber or tool. It was a sacrifice, demanded and given, to keep the thing laughing and the village above safe. Forgive me, Daniel. Forgive me. The name at the end blurred, ink bled by moisture, but Daniel saw enough. His father had written it for him, for the son who would one day return, the son who would demand to know the truth. Daniel's breath came shallow, his chest tight. He pressed the ledger to his chest as though holding his father's final heartbeat. Around him the laughter raged, wild now, as though delighted by his discovery. It rose in waves, high-pitched and guttural, ricocheting through the chamber until he thought the walls might split. And beneath the laughter, woven so faintly he almost missed it, came a single phrase, not in his father's hand, not in any human voice, but in a tone that seemed older than the rock itself, older than breath. Your turn. The lantern sputtered, flame shrinking to a trembling spark. The chamber plunged into deep shadow, stone pressing close. The laughter lingered, sharp as nails, endless as the dark. Daniel clutched the ledger tighter, but the words on the page shifted under his fingers, as if wet ink crawled, letters rearranging themselves into lines he could not bear to read. He shut the book, trembling, but the sound followed, louder, closer, curling into his ears like a hand pressing him into the role his father had tried to resist. He staggered to his feet, eyes darting to the passageway out. The path was narrow, unstable, and the laughter filled it like smoke. He did not move. He could not. The chamber itself seemed to hold him, timbers groaning, rocks shuddering in mirth. And as he stood there, the ledger heavy in his grasp, Daniel felt the faintest twitch at the corners of his mouth, as though his own body had begun to betray him, as though the thing in the mind had already chosen its next voice. Daniel pressed his back against the jagged wall, the ledger heavy against his chest as though it were a stone pulled from the collapse itself. His father's words clung to his mind, etched deeper than the ink on the fragile pages. Not an accident, a sacrifice. Forgive me. The voices seemed to savor the revelation, their laughter swelling in triumphant ripples that darted through every crevice of the chamber. The sound no longer came from around him, it came from inside him, curling into the hollows of his lungs, hitching against his ribs until his breath threatened to break into mirth he did not feel. He clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. His lips twitched anyway. A faint smile tugged at his mouth, the kind a man forces in polite company. It spread against his will, wider, baring teeth into the dark. He felt the edges of it tremble, unnatural, as though his muscles had been claimed by another's hand. The laughter pressed harder, overlapping, cascading, a theater of echoes with no source yet infinite audience. He thought of his father, of men choking in dust and darkness, not dying but swallowed, their voices stripped of grief and bent into jests, songs, guffaws. He saw them with terrible clarity, faces locked in mirth, mouths open, throats tearing with laughter that never ended. The ledger slid from his hands, pages fanning across the stone. He bent to snatch it, desperate to cling to the last proof that this was real, but the ink seemed to blur again, shapes writhing on the page like ants scattered across sugar. He blinked hard, and the words twisted into fragments, phrases rising and collapsing. Tell it stories. The walls shake. Your turn, your turn, your turn. The chamber pulsed in time with the repetition. Rocks shuddered as though struck by a distant hammer. Dust sifted from the ceiling, coating his hair and shoulders in a fine, choking veil. Daniel staggered backward, lantern swinging wildly, flame guttering. Shadows stretched long and wrong, bending against the angles of the stone, bending with the rhythm of the laughter. Something shifted in the collapse mound before him. Stones rattled, timbers creaked, as if the weight of the dead stirred beneath. A voice rose distinct from the chorus, rich and deep, the one he had longed for and dreaded in equal measure. His father. The tone carried the same cadence Daniel remembered from childhood, when bedtime stories were told in a voice that rumbled through floorboards. But now the words were warped, bent into mirth, his father's laugh echoing with strain that cut deep into Daniel's chest. It was joyous in sound, but hollow in heart, an imitation stretched too thin. Daniel dropped to his knees, palms clapped to his ears, rocking forward as if the motion could shake the sound loose. His father's laughter wove through him, latching onto marrow, and he felt something tug inside his throat. His breath hitched, not in sobs but in small bursts of laughter, sharp and alien, slipping out between clenched teeth. The more he resisted, the louder they came, until the chamber seemed filled with two laughters, his father's booming and his own brittle, both feeding the endless chorus. Tears blurred his vision. He tasted salt, iron, dust. He wanted to scream, but each attempt dissolved into a chuckle. His stomach clenched. His ribs ached. Yet the mirth continued, wrung from him like water from cloth. He forced himself to crawl toward the ledger, clawing across gravel, fingers scraping until they split. He seized the book, pressed it to his chest, whispered hoarsely around laughter that would not stop. Number, not me, not mine. His voice cracked, his throat raw, but the words barely existed before they bent, reshaped into a strangled giggle. The laughter around him swelled, delighted, mocking. He felt it approve. Shadows leaned closer, curling from the corners of the chamber. He thought he saw shapes in them, faces, half-formed, mouths split wide, eyes empty but glinting with mirth. Their heads tilted back, teeth flashing as they convulsed in endless humor. They pressed closer until the dark itself seemed to smile. The ledger pulsed with heat against his chest. He cracked it open, eyes frantic, and saw fresh words bleeding onto the page, as though written by an invisible hand. It is easier if you surrender. The laughter will carry you. The laughter will keep you. The laughter will make you part of us. His vision swam. He slammed the book shut, shaking his head violently, spit flying. His own laughter rose higher, pitched and jagged, out of rhythm with his breath. He forced himself to his feet, stumbled toward the tunnel, lantern jerking, flame barely clinging to wick. Each step was a battle, the laughter dragging at his heels like chains. The corridor stretched impossibly long. The timbers bowed inward, bending like ribs of some enormous beast that had swallowed him whole. The echoes of his father's laugh followed, swelling, multiplying, until he could not distinguish it from his own. He staggered, fell against the wall, and in the vibration of the stone felt hundreds of throats straining in chorus. His mouth opened wider, jaw aching, the laugh pouring out of him in sharp barks. He felt blood trickle down his throat, torn from vocal cords, scraped raw. Still the sound continued, no longer his but theirs. Somewhere deep in the mine, beneath the chorus, beneath the shifting rock, he thought he heard another sound, not laughter, but applause, a hollow, rhythmic clap that beat through the stone, slow and endless, approving the newest act in its eternal performance. Daniel clutched the ledger like a drowning man clutches driftwood. His hands shook so violently that the book slipped free, tumbling across stone. Pages fanned, catching in the draft, ink glistening with phrases that writhed and vanished as quickly as he tried to read them. He crawled after it, nails tearing, but each time he reached, the book slid farther, carried by some unseen current deeper into the mine. The laughter built to a crescendo. The chamber throbbed with sound. His ribs felt as though they would crack, his lungs as though they would burst. He could no longer tell if he was still crawling, or if the mine itself had pulled him into its belly. The last thing he knew was the sight of his father's name scrawled across a page, glowing faintly in the lantern's dying light, before his vision blurred with tears and his own laughter drowned him whole. Daniel did not know how long he had been crawling through the dark. The lantern had sputtered out somewhere behind him, its flame strangled by damp air, leaving only the faint phosphorescence of minerals smeared along the walls. His laughter had grown hoarse, breaking into coughs that sprayed flecks of blood, yet the sound persisted, wrung from him by a will stronger than his own. Each cough was answered by the chorus, an echo that bent his agony into amusement, as though every shudder of his chest were a punchline offered for their delight. The tunnel tilted downward, narrowing into ribs of timber that bent like a cage. His fingernails clawed splinters from the wood as he pulled himself forward, knees scraping against gravel. He felt no hunger, no thirst, only the gnawing ache of lungs forced into ceaseless mirth. His jaw ached, muscles cramping, cheeks split with raw strain. When he pressed trembling hands to his face, he felt his mouth still curled into its smile, carved there as though stone had replaced flesh. The ledger was gone, swallowed into the dark, but he still felt its weight, ghostly, against his chest, as if the memory of his father's words had embedded itself into his ribs. They pulsed faintly with each beat of his heart, not comfort but reminder. The mind doesn't take, it keeps. And indeed, he felt kept. The laughter around him shifted, no longer scattered but patterned. It rose in crescendos, fell in pauses, moved like dialogue exchanged on a stage. He realized with a sinking horror that he was hearing not a chorus of madness but a performance in eternal theater where the dead played their roles again and again, compelled by the presence that demanded entertainment. The laughter was not theirs. It was the script. Faces began to bloom in the walls. At first, faint, shadows caught in mineral veins, then clearer, pressed outward from the rock like fossils trapped mid-gesture. Mouths wide, eyes pinched, brows arched in eternal mirth. Their teeth gleamed in the faint glow, their lips cracked but forever parted in delight. He saw men he recognized from old photographs, neighbors his father had spoken of, even the boyhood friend of his own uncle, all locked in expressions too broad to be human. Their laughter pulsed from the stone itself, a vibration that rattled his bones. He stumbled onward, clutching at the air. His own breath came in ragged bursts, half sob, half cackle. Somewhere inside he still screamed, but no sound of it escaped. His throat was not his own anymore. It had been tuned to another frequency, forced to harmonize with the mind's eternal chorus. At last he collapsed in a cavern wider than any before. The ceiling vanished into darkness, the floor dipped uneven, and the remains of timbers jutted like broken ribs. Here the laughter was thickest, saturating the air until it seemed physical, pressing against his skin. The walls glistened wet, not with water but with sheen of sweat wrung from unseen bodies, condensation of sound itself. In the center of the cavern lay a hollow, a depression ringed with stone that seemed smoother, worn down by decades of bodies pressed against it. Daniel crawled to the edge and looked down. He wished he had not. The pit was filled not with rock or soil, but with faces. Not whole bodies, just faces, layered like masks upon masks, mouths open, eyes vacant, every one of them locked in laughter. They shifted faintly, as though stirred by a current from below, sliding across one another, teeth clicking. Their voices rose in perfect unison, joy sharpened to cruelty. Daniel clutched his head, nails digging into scalp, yet the sound filled him regardless. His body convulsed, back arching, mouth stretching until he feared his jaw would snap. The laughter that burst from him now was no longer ragged or broken, but full, round, resonant, joining the chorus with ease. And in that moment he understood the trap. The mind did not kill the men. It harvested them. It took their grief, their fear, their memory, and twisted it into performance. Each new soul became another voice in the eternal theater, another face pressed into the pit. Their existence was not ended, but repurposed, forced into an endless carnival for the amusement of the presence buried deep in the earth. He felt himself sliding toward it, the last scraps of his identity loosening like gravel underfoot. He clung desperately to one thing, one thought, his father's apology. "Forgive me, Daniel." That sliver of memory flared, thin but stubborn. He seized it, wrapping his mind around it, using it as an anchor. With a guttural cry that cracked into laughter halfway through, he slammed his fists against the rock, the sound echoing off the cavern walls. The pit of faces wavered, their mouths opening wider, their mirth rising to a shriek. He forced himself backward, dragging his body toward the tunnel. Each inch was agony, laughter exploding from his throat against his will, ribs aching, chest burning. The mind resisted, pulling him with invisible threads of sound. The faces in the wall turned toward him as he passed, their mirth sharpening into grins too wide, as though mocking his resistance. But still he crawled. His hands bled, his knees tore, his throat shredded itself raw. Yet some stubborn part of him refused to let go, clinging to the memory of the man who had been swallowed first, the man who had left a book behind not as surrender but as warning. When he reached the narrow tunnel, he collapsed, face pressed to gravel, body shaking with laughter that no longer belonged to him. His vision blurred, spots dancing, the pit's glow still imprinted behind his eyes. He did not know if he had truly escaped the cavern, or if he had simply been absorbed into another layer of its maze. Somewhere behind him, the applause returned, slow, heavy, certain. The sound followed him into the dark. Daniel lay sprawled in the tunnel, body convulsing with spasms of laughter that shredded his throat raw. His chest heaved, his mouth gaped, but no scream could escape, only a series of ragged chuckles pulled from him like threads unwound from cloth. His fingernails were broken, his palms a lattice of blood and grit, yet he clawed the stone as if sheer force of will might drag him away from the pit, away from the hollow filled with faces, away from the sound that wanted to own him. But the mine was patient. The laughter did not retreat. It rolled in waves through the chamber, through the tunnels, through the very marrow of his bones. Sometimes it sounded like joy, other times like mockery, but always it was endless. And beneath it, steady as a drumbeat, the applause persisted, slow, deliberate, the sound of hands that were no longer flesh clapping in rhythm for a performance that had no curtain call. He pushed himself upright, swaying, forehead striking the low timber above so hard he saw stars. The shock of pain gave him a breath of silence, a gap in which his own voice gasped through, hoarse and almost human. Number. The word fell flat, swallowed instantly, mocked by a dozen chuckles bouncing back at him. The ledger had vanished into the dark behind him, but he still felt its presence. The words were burned into his mind, the ink tattooed on his veins. It doesn't take, it keeps. His father's voice echoed that sentence until it became indistinguishable from the others. Yet Daniel clung to it as the last fragment of difference between himself and the pit. He staggered forward, deeper into the passage. His legs shook, muscles weak from strain, yet some unseen current pushed him along, not toward escape but toward return. Each step carried the weight of inevitability. The laughter thickened as he moved, rising in volume until the air seemed to vibrate, until his teeth chattered in his skull. The tunnel widened, and once more he stood at the edge of the cavern. The pit below churned with faces, their mouths stretching wider as if to greet him. Their joy was grotesque, but it was also warm, familiar, like family gathered for a story they already knew by heart. His father's face surfaced among them, eyes hollow, mouth open in a laugh that rolled like thunder. For a moment, Daniel's knees buckled. He wanted to collapse, to let himself be carried down into that sea of masks, to dissolve into the rhythm. But another part of him, small and flickering, still fought. He remembered nights at the kitchen table when his father had returned from the mine, weary but alive, silent but present. He remembered the sound of boots at the door, the smell of coal dust clinging to skin. He remembered a man, not a voice, not a mask. That memory steadied him, just enough. He picked up a splintered beam from the rubble, its end sharpened by the collapse into a crude spear. His hands trembled as he raised it, not toward the faces but toward his own chest. His body shook with laughter, yet his mind whispered fiercely, better to end than to be kept. The cavern reacted instantly. The laughter shifted to a shriek, high and jagged, the sound of 1,000 throats protesting. The applause thundered faster, hands slapping stone in furious rhythm. The very walls shook, dust raining down. Daniel pressed the jagged wood against his sternum. His arms trembled. His ribs felt brittle. He pushed and the mine itself resisted. His muscles locked, seized by an alien will, forcing the weapon aside. His mouth opened wider, laughter bursting free, drowning his cry. The faces in the pit swelled with delight. His father's laugh roared above them all, breaking into jagged hiccups of mirth. The ledger's words twisted in his mind, the ink shifting until they read something else entirely. Not your choice, never yours. The beam fell from his grip, clattering against stone. His knees gave way, body collapsing at the edge of the pit. His arms spread wide, palms pressed to rock, slick with condensation. The laughter that erupted from his throat now was no longer forced, no longer jagged. It was full, round, perfectly in tune with the chorus. And in that moment, Daniel felt the last sliver of resistance peel away. His face stretched, his eyes blurred, and he felt himself sliding into the wall, into the pit, into the theater of echoes. His voice joined the others, indistinguishable, woven into the endless script. The cavern steadied. The applause slowed, softened, then ceased. The laughter evened into a steady chorus, seamless, eternal. The performance continued. Above ground, the mine remained silent, abandoned, its entrance yawning like any other scar in the earth. Grass grew at its edges. Wind whistled through broken boards. and the world forgot the men swallowed within. But deep inside, Daniel laughed forever, shoulder to shoulder with his father, their voices locked in grotesque harmony. And the presence at the core of the mine, ancient and unseen, leaned back into the dark, satisfied, because the show always went on. Story 3. The Last Night of a Lifeguard. They say a swimming pool at night is nothing more than a mirror turned inward, dark water reflecting back not the stars, but your own fear. Kevin didn't believe that. Not yet. He was 23, freshly hired, and grateful for the paycheck that came with an overnight shift most others avoided. A lifeguard's job was simple in theory. Watch the water, wait for nothing to happen, and in the rare case something did, dive in and save a life. But the municipal pool had a reputation, and reputations stick like chlorine to the skin. Over the years, 3 drownings had taken place there, all after hours, all in the same spot, the far end of the deep lane, beneath the faint glow of the diving boards. The official reports labeled them accidents, reckless teens, illicit midnight swims, poor timing and poor judgment. But the old-timers whispered otherwise. They said the water down there never gave back what it took. When Kevin mentioned he had been assigned the graveyard shift, one of the senior guards smirked and muttered, "Watch the deep end. If it calls to you, don't answer." Kevin laughed then, though the sound rang hollow. The pool was different at night. The cheerful shouts of children, the whistle blows, the echo of splashing, all of it dissolved into an oppressive quiet. The lights hummed weakly, buzzing overhead, their reflections trembling in the black water. The air smelled of bleach and wet concrete, sharp and sterile, yet beneath it lingered something else, something faint and organic, like pond algae that had no business in a filtered system. He sat in the lifeguard chair, high above the still surface, clipboard in hand. His flashlight lay across his lap, though the glow of the overheads was enough to keep the water gleaming like a pane of glass. Every now and then, he jotted notes, mostly to stay awake. 11:45 p.m. All clear. 12:10 a.m. Water steady. No activity. 12:30 a.m. Faint echo, like someone moving in locker room. Checked. Empty. His pen tapped against the page. The silence pressed harder with each tick of the clock. Around 1 o'clock he heard it. A splash. Small. Distant. As if someone had slipped into the water at the far end. His body reacted before his mind did, flashlight snapping up, beam cutting across the black surface. Nothing. No ripples. No disturbance. Only the faint trembling reflection of the ceiling lamps. He leaned forward, squinting. The surface was too perfect. Water always moved, even in stillness. Tiny shivers. Subtle waves. But here, at the deep end, it seemed, waiting. Kevin climbed down, boots squeaking against damp tile. The smell of chlorine thickened as he walked closer, though he swore he caught something else beneath it, something brackish, like river water left stagnant in the Sunday. "Hello?" His voice echoed across the cavernous room, bouncing back distorted. He hated how small it sounded. No answer. He crouched at the pool's edge, flashlight beam cutting through the surface. The cone of light plunged downward, illuminating the pale tiles. The dark ladder, the rope divider floating limp at mid-length. Nothing unusual. No figure lurking below. Still, his heart thudded, because as the beam cut deeper, he saw something shift. Not movement exactly, but a distortion, like a shadow moving against the light. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the ripple of his own breath disturbing the water. Kevin stood, shook his head, muttered to himself. Tired. That's all. Tricks of the eye. Back in the chair, he tried to focus on his logbook, but the silence had changed. The pool was no longer still. It was listening. Every creak of his chair, every scuff of his boot echoed unnaturally, as though magnified by the walls. The hum of the overhead lamps dipped in and out, syncing with the rhythm of his pulse. And then came the voice, faint, carried through water, bubbling upward in tones half playful, half distant. A child's voice, high-pitched, muffled. "Marco." Kevin froze. The sound was unmistakable. The first call of a game he had played 100 times as a child. His throat went dry. Another voice answered, lower, warped by water. "Polo." Kevin's flashlight beam trembled in his hands. He swept it across the pool, heart hammering. Empty. The water shimmered back blankly. His chest tightened. "Who's there?" he called. though he already knew the answer would not comfort him. No response. Only a faint ripple at the far lane, like fingers breaking the surface before slipping away. He forced himself to stand, his body moving on instinct. He strode along the pool's edge, eyes darting between the black water and the shadows pooling in the rafters above. His boots echoed too loud. The ladder at the deep end clanged softly, swaying though no one touched it. When he reached the diving boards, he stopped. The air was colder here. He leaned over, shining his light straight down. The beam cut through layer after layer of darkness, revealing nothing, just endless blue tiles that seemed to stretch deeper than they should, too far for a pool of its dimensions. The depth sign read 12 feet, but the flashlight fell farther, until it dissolved into black. And in that black, something shimmered, a pale blur, hair floating, limbs drifting as though suspended. Kevin's breath caught. He blinked, and it was gone. Behind him, water slapped sharply, as though a hand had struck the surface. He spun, flashlight whipping across the pool. Nothing, but the voice came again, clearer now. Marco, and from directly beneath him, beneath the diving board where no one could be, came the reply. Polo. Kevin gripped the railing of the diving board so tightly his knuckles ached. His flashlight trembled in his other hand, the beam cutting jagged swaths across the water. He could still hear the voices, those playful calls from childhood, warped now by depth and distance. Marco, Polo. The sound rose from the deep end as if the tiles themselves were speaking. He muttered to himself, "There's no one here. There's no one here." But the certainty cracked with each repetition. The pool was locked. The gates chained. The doors bolted. He had checked every corner before his shift. He was alone. And yet, the game had begun without him. Kevin stepped back from the diving board, his boots squealing against wet tile. The sound echoed too long, stretching unnaturally, until it felt like the walls themselves were mocking his retreat. His chest heaved, breath shallow, each inhale tinged with the sterile sting of chlorine. He returned to his chair, climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time, and perched above the pool like a sentry. His logbook sat open on his lap, the pen clattering against the clipboard with each tremor of his hand. He forced himself to write. 1:45 a.m. Voices in deep end. Sounded like children. Checked area. No one present. Possible auditory hallucination. But even as he wrote it, the words rang false. His training, his instincts, everything told him to trust his senses around water. And his senses told him there was something below. The surface shifted, just slightly. A ripple spreading outward from the lane ropes, slow and deliberate, like fingers brushing beneath. Kevin leaned forward, flashlight beam trembling across the disturbance. Nothing broke the surface, nothing visible at all. And then came laughter, high-pitched, gurgling, as though bubbling up through lungs filled with water. It echoed faintly, bouncing off tile and concrete, making it impossible to tell where it originated. He felt his stomach knot. His whistle sat at his chest, dangling useless. What would he even blow it for? There were no children to scold, no swimmers to summon. Only a pool that wanted to play. He climbed down from the chair again. His boots slapped against the tile, each step carrying him closer to the deep end, despite the cold weight of dread pressing against his spine. The ladder at the far lane rattled softly. Kevin swung his flashlight toward it. The metal bars quivered, water lapping against them, though the surface remained undisturbed elsewhere. He approached slowly, knees stiff, the air colder with each step. When he reached the edge, he crouched, gripping the tiles with damp palms. The flashlight beam cut straight down. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Just the blue floor, tiles stretching 12 feet below. Then hair floated into view. Long, dark, undulating as if caught in an invisible current. A pale face followed, eyes open, lips parting soundlessly. Kevin gasped, jerking the light away. When he looked back, the water was empty. He staggered back, heart slamming against his ribs. His breath caught on a whisper that wasn't his own. "Marco." Kevin spun, but the pool deck was empty. The water replied, a low gurgle rising from beneath. "Polo." The sound rippled through him, vibrating against his bones. He stumbled to the bench against the wall, collapsing with his head in his hands. He tried to think rationally. Chlorine fumes could play tricks. Fatigue could trigger auditory hallucinations. He hadn't slept well. He hadn't eaten enough. His body was betraying him. But hallucinations didn't ripple the water, didn't move the ladder, didn't know the rules of a game he had played as a boy. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing from the rafters above. Kevin raised his head slowly, dread thick in his veins. The sound did not come from the pool this time. It circled the air, bouncing along beams and vents, as though children were running just out of sight. He stared up, flashlight beam darting across the metal framework, catching nothing but dust. The laughter ceased abruptly. Silence crashed down. Kevin realized then that he was holding his breath. He exhaled shakily, and in that instant the water beneath the diving boards erupted, not violently, not like a splash, but with dozens of small ripples, concentric circles spreading outward as though many hands had brushed the surface at once. He froze, rooted to the bench, unable to move. His flashlight shook in his hand, the beam jittering across the ceiling. Then the water, then his own trembling boots. Voices rose together. Mako, Mako, Mako. Dozens of them now, layered, echoing, overlapping until the word lost its shape and became a chant. The replies followed, deeper, slower, impossibly heavy. Polo. Kevin clapped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound vibrated inside him, worming into his chest, crawling along his spine. He stumbled back to his chair, dragging himself upward rung by rung, as though height might save him. From above, he looked down at the black water. The ripples had stopped. The surface gleamed once more like obsidian, and in that gleam, he saw faces. Not clear, not sharp, but pale ovals drifting beneath, eyes open, mouths stretched in laughter that made no sound. They hovered just below the surface, dozens of them, rising and falling in rhythm with the lights overhead. Kevin blinked hard. When he opened his eyes again, the faces were gone. His chest heaved. His whistle slipped from his fingers, clattering against the deck below. The sound echoed far too long, as though the building itself wanted to remember it. Then, in the silence that followed, the game began again. Mako. This time, the voice was close, right beside his ear. Kevin jerked violently, nearly falling from the chair. He spun, flashlight beam slashing the empty air behind him. Nothing. Polo. The reply came from his own mouth, but he hadn't spoken. The sound rose from his throat unbidden, shaping itself with his breath, escaping against his will. His lips had moved, his tongue had formed the syllables, but the voice was not his own. Panic flooded him. He clamped his mouth shut, pressed his palm against his lips, but the vibration continued, resonating from deep in his chest. The pool below rippled gently, as though pleased. Kevin realized with icy certainty, the game was no longer calling him. It was using him. Kevin sat frozen in the lifeguard chair, hand pressed hard against his mouth, breath trembling through his nose. The word polo still echoed in his skull. It had not been spoken aloud anymore, but the vibration remained, a phantom syllable his body carried like an infection. His throat burned, aching with the effort to suppress it, yet every pulse of his heart seemed to insist on shaping the word again. The pool below was still once more, still, but not peaceful. The black water gleamed with an oily sheen, waiting, reflecting the shuddering lights above like eyes half closed in amusement. Kevin forced his body to move. He climbed down the chair, boots hitting tile with a dull slap. He grabbed the whistle from where it had fallen and clenched it tight in his fist, though the idea of blowing it now seemed absurd, like using a child's toy against a storm. Still, it was something to hold, something that tethered him to the role he knew. Lifeguard, protector, the one who watched the water, not the one who drowned in it. He paced the length of the pool, flashlight beam cutting across the lanes. He spoke under his breath, as though narrating to himself could keep him sane. Check the perimeter, secure the doors, confirm nobody inside. It's just water, just a pool. But the pool disagreed. From the far end came a faint sound, not a splash, not a voice, a drip, like water leaking from a faucet. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Each drop seemed amplified, echoing across the cavernous room. Kevin followed it against his will, step by step, the sound guiding him to the diving boards once more. When he reached the edge, he saw it, a small ring of water spreading outward at the surface, as though something had risen and sunk again in the exact same spot. The ring widened, then faded. Another followed, and another. Drip, drip, drip. Kevin crouched, leaning over the edge, flashlight beam piercing the black below. Faces stared back, dozens, pale and wavering, their eyes open, mouths stretched in silent mirth. They hovered just beneath the surface, not rising, not sinking, simply waiting. And though their lips did not move, Kevin heard them, clear as a bell, inside his mind. "Marco," he gasped, stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The answer rose not from the pool this time, not from the walls, but from deep inside his chest. His lips parted against his will, his voice spilling out like water rushing from a broken pipe. "Polo." The water reacted instantly. A ripple surged across the surface, rushing outward as though dozens of bodies had kicked beneath in perfect unison. The ladder rattled violently. The rope divider bobbed. The diving boards groaned. Kevin clutched his throat, horror flooding him. The game wasn't only calling him anymore. It was using him as a piece, his voice part of its rules. He stumbled back along the deck, boots squealing on tile, eyes darting for the exit doors. He could leave. He had to leave. Report the incident. Quit the job. Never come back. But when he reached the door, he froze. The chain was unlatched. He had locked it himself at the start of his shift. He remembered the click, the cold bite of the padlock in his palm. Now it dangled loose, swinging slightly as though someone had only just passed through. His breath caught. He shoved the door open, heart leaping with hope only to find the night outside impossibly still. No wind, no rain, no sound of the city beyond. Just silence, thick and absolute, pressing against him like a wall. Kevin stepped back inside instinctively, slamming the door shut, reattaching the chain with fumbling hands. The silence outside was worse than the voices within. At least here, he knew the game was waiting. Out there, he could not tell if the world had ended, or if the pool had simply cut him off from it. When he turned back, the water was no longer still. Something was surfacing. Slowly, steadily, a shape rose from the deep end, just beneath the boards. Hair floated first dark, swaying in unseen currents. Then came a face, pale and bloated, eyes wide open, lips stretched into an obscene smile. It hovered just beneath the surface, staring directly at him. Unmoving, Kevin raised the flashlight with shaking hands. The beam struck the figure, scattering across its features. For an instant, he thought he recognized it. Not a stranger, not one of the children who had drowned here. It was him. His own face stared back, distorted by water, eyes glassy, mouth open in a grin he could not remember making. Kevin staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. He tripped against a bench, fell hard, the flashlight clattering away and rolling across the tile until it spun uselessly toward the shallow end. The beam cut wild arcs across the ceiling, leaving him in darkness. The laughter returned. This time it was everywhere above, below, inside his skull. High-pitched, gurgling, endless. It circled him, swelling into a chorus that rattled the rafters. "Marco," he clamped his hands over his ears, screaming back, "No, stop." But his own voice betrayed him again, tearing free in perfect time. "Polo." The water erupted. Dozens of pale hands burst from the surface, slapping against the tiles, clawing for purchase. They were small, thin, fingers splayed like those of children, nails ragged, skin pallid. They reached upward, not far, not enough to climb out, but enough to show intent, enough to show hunger. Kevin scrambled backward on hands and knees, heart hammering, breath ragged. His back hit the far wall. He stared as the hands withdrew slowly, sinking beneath the surface one by one, leaving only ripples behind. The game had not finished. It had only reminded him of the rules. "Marco." The word rose again, soft now, coaxing. Kevin's lips trembled. He bit down hard, the taste of blood flooding his mouth, refusing to answer. His throat convulsed with the effort of silence. The reply came anyway. "Polo." His voice, but not his will. The pool shimmered, satisfied. Kevin's body convulsed with sobs. He realized then that it didn't matter if he resisted. The game had claimed him the moment he heard it. His role was already written, and the only thing left to decide was how long he could last before the water wanted him inside. Kevin pressed himself against the wall, chest heaving, every breath shallow and ragged. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum rising and falling like the uneven beating of a heart. His body trembled, his throat raw from swallowing words that were not his own. Yet the pool continued to wait, black surface shimmering faintly, ripples crossing in patterns too deliberate to be accidents. He wanted to leave. Every muscle screamed for him to run, to abandon his post, to let the pool drown in its silence without him. But he could not force his legs toward the chained door. Some instinct told him that the world outside no longer belonged to him, that if he stepped beyond, the silence there would be worse than the voices here. The laughter came again, softer now, rising from beneath the water like bubbles that refused to break the surface. Kevin staggered toward the lifeguard chair, climbing 2 rungs before his body refused to go higher. From the seat, the pool spread before him like a mouth. From the ground, it loomed like a mirror. Somewhere between the two, he was caught, neither safe above nor free below. Marco, the voice was closer this time, not childlike anymore, older, deeper, weary with use. Kevin whipped his head toward the shallow end, then the deep, but there was no single source. The voice seemed to rise from every ripple, from every tile, from every drop of water in the air. His lips twitched against his will. He slammed his fist against his jaw to stop them, biting his tongue hard enough to taste iron. Tears welled in his eyes. The pain was sharp, grounding. For a moment, it worked. He remained silent. Polo. The reply came anyway, not from his throat but from the whistle dangling against his chest. The tiny silver tube vibrated, shrill and broken, spilling the word in a mechanical cry. Kevin tore it from his neck and hurled it across the room. It clattered against the tiles, spinning into the shadows, but the echo lingered long after it stopped moving. The pool shimmered, pleased. He realized then that the game did not need him to speak. It had him already. His body, his tools, his very presence were enough. He was not resisting. He was participating, whether he wished it or not. The water stirred. Kevin froze as pale forms rose slowly from the deep end. Not bodies, not whole. At first only hair, dark strands swaying like weeds. Then hands, pallid and thin, fingers flexing as though testing joints long unused. The shapes hovered beneath the surface, faces pale blurs, eyes wide and unblinking. One of them reached the surface. A hand broke through, dripping water, skin gray and puckered. It slapped gently against the tile with a sound like wet cloth, leaving a dark print before sinking again. Kevin stumbled backward off the chair, nearly twisting his ankle as he landed. His flashlight beam whipped wildly, catching glimpses of more hands rising, more faces forming just beneath the surface. The water seethed with quiet anticipation. Marco. This time the voice came from behind him. He spun, light slicing across empty bleachers, empty walls. No one, nothing, only the echo of his own ragged breath. Polo. He turned back and found the pool no longer empty. Dozens of faces hovered just beneath the surface, aligned in a grotesque symmetry. Children, teenagers, adults, all pale and silent, their mouths stretching wider than possible, teeth gleaming faintly in the artificial light. Their eyes locked on him, unblinking. Kevin staggered back until his shoulders hit the far wall. The flashlight slipped from his grip, beam rolling across the floor, settling on the ladder at the deep end. The metal rungs shook violently now, clanging in rhythm with the voices. "Stop," he whispered, voice breaking. "Please, stop." The pool answered with silence. And then, slowly, deliberately, something rose. A figure surfaced just enough for its face to break the water. The skin was swollen, lips pale, hair plastered across its brow. But the eyes, God, the eyes were open, bright, and fixed directly on him. Kevin knew that face. He had seen it earlier tonight, though not like this. It was his own. He fell to his knees, gasping, bile rising. His reflection in the water grinned, teeth too sharp, mouth too wide. It mouthed the words he had been forced to speak again and again. Polo. The laughter erupted, no longer faint, no longer distant. It roared from every corner, rattling the tiles, shaking the rafters, a cacophony of joy and hunger. Kevin clutched his ears, screaming, but the sound was inside him now. Hands burst from the water again, dozens of them, slapping against the deck, reaching for him. The prints they left steamed against the tiles, as though burning with cold. The smell of chlorine thickened, mingled with something fouler, rotting pond scum, the stench of stagnant water long sealed away. He crawled backward, desperate, until his back hit the emergency exit. The chain rattled against his spine. He groped for the latch, fingers slick with sweat, but the metal was ice cold, numbing his grip. "Marco." The word was so close, it might as well have been whispered directly into his ear. "Polo." His lips moved with the answer, though no air left his lungs. The water surged. A wave rushed over the deck, soaking his boots, drenching his legs. He looked down and saw the hands again, not reaching from the pool this time, but crawling along the water, spilling across the tiles, fingers dragging toward him. Kevin scrambled upward, clawing at the door, slamming his shoulder against it. The chain rattled, but the lock held firm. Behind him, the sound of rushing water grew louder, closer, as though the pool had decided to spill itself forward to claim him. He screamed, turned, and saw them, dozens of pale figures rising from the deep end, breaking the surface one after another. Their mouths opened in laughter, their eyes fixed on him. They were climbing now, pulling themselves onto the deck with jerky, unnatural movements, leaving puddles that spread like shadows. "Marco." The chorus shook the building. Kevin's body betrayed him again. His lips stretched wide in a grin that was not his own, and the words slipped out in a voice he no longer recognized. "Polo." The pool had ceased pretending. It no longer whispered or teased, no longer played at shadows and echoes. It revealed itself fully now, and Kevin understood too late that it had never been a collection of accidents or tragic coincidences. It had always been a hunger disguised as a game. Water spilled over the tiles in sheets, creeping across the deck like a tide breaking free of its boundaries. His boots soaked through instantly, the cold biting his ankles as if the liquid itself had fingers curling around him. The surface he had watched so carefully hours ago was gone, replaced by a roiling skin of pale faces rising and sinking, eyes open, mouths twisted in laughter that did not need sound to be heard. Kevin pressed himself against the exit door, shoulders aching from the force of his attempts to break it open, but the chain might as well have been welded shut. Every shove, every kick, every desperate cry was answered not by freedom but by the tremble of walls, the shudder of beams above, the soft slap of hands pulling themselves steadily closer. The air grew thick with chlorine, so sharp it burned his lungs, yet beneath it was the undeniable smell of stagnant water left too long in darkness, carrying with it a heaviness that clogged his throat. The first hand touched him, cold, rubbery, fingers slick with slime. It wrapped around his ankle and tugged. Kevin screamed, not in words but in raw panic, scrambling higher against the door, as if he could climb his way up the metal. His boot slipped free for a moment, leaving the hand clutching empty water, but another followed, seizing his wrist this time. Then another gripped his thigh, another his shoulder. They were countless, crawling from the water as though the pool had grown 1,000 arms, all determined to draw him down. The laughter rose, not with glee but inevitability. It was not a sound of joy. It was the rhythm of victory, a chorus that had sung the same refrain for everybody it had claimed before him. The game was not played to amuse. The game was played to win, and the pool had never lost. Kevin thrashed, his back scraping against the door, nails tearing at the chain until his fingers bled. He told himself to hold on, that if he resisted long enough, morning would come. The sun would pierce the windows, and whatever nightmare haunted the water would retreat. But even as he clung to that hope, the thought collapsed beneath the weight of a deeper truth. Morning had no place here. The world outside might have ceased altogether. All that existed was the pool, the water, the game. Hands tugged harder, jerking him to his knees. He clawed at the tiles, palms skidding across wet concrete, leaving streaks of blood where skin tore. His whistle lay abandoned near the shallow end, the small metal tube glowing faintly in the light, vibrating with the rhythm of the voices. It shrieked suddenly, a distorted blast, not shrill but guttural, echoing the word he had come to dread. "Marco," his body answered without permission, lips cracking open, throat spilling the reply even as tears streamed down his face. "Polo." The water erupted. He was dragged forward, chest slamming against the tiles as dozens of hands pulled him inch by inch toward the black surface. He kicked, twisted, begged the door behind him to open with one final miracle, but it did not yield. The pool had him. It had always had him. The surface broke cold against his face. Chlorine stung his eyes, filled his nose, invaded his mouth before he could hold his breath. His scream bubbled upward, lost instantly in the chorus of laughter that surrounded him. The world of air vanished, replaced by weight, pressure, and movement all around. He saw them clearly now. The drowned, children with hair streaming like ink, eyes wide, limbs twisting unnaturally in the current, teenagers with mouths frozen in grins too wide, their bodies drifting yet their hands purposeful. Adults with gray skin and hollow eyes, dragging themselves through the water with a strength that did not belong to flesh. They circled him, mouths opening in unison, and from those mouths came the chant, distorted by bubbles, each syllable vibrating through the liquid. Marco, his body convulsed, his lungs burned, yet still the answer escaped, muffled and broken, bubbles rising as though the word itself carried more force than his breath. Polo. The circle closed. Faces pressed closer, pale hands stroking his skin, tangling in his hair, pulling him deeper. He flailed, but his strength was nothing against theirs. The surface shrank above him, a distant pane of trembling light. The walls of the pool stretched impossibly far, tiles descending endlessly as though the bottom had no end. Kevin's vision swam, darkness blooming at the edges. His lungs screamed, but no air remained, only the chant, endless, patient, weaving itself into his very pulse. Marco, Polo, Marco, Polo, and then he saw himself again, floating opposite, face pale, lips split in a grin that matched the drowned. His own eyes stared back at him, glassy and unblinking, welcoming him to the circle. The last of his will broke. The final bubble escaped his lips. The water filled him, not with silence, but with the game. Above, the pool stilled. The ripples faded. The surface smoothed into perfect glass once more. The lifeguard chair stood empty. The whistle lay silent. The logbook on the deck soaked through, ink bleeding into illegible spirals. And if anyone listened closely in that dark, sterile room, they would hear it again, faint but unmistakable. Marco, the water waited for its next reply. Story 4. The Painter of Forgotten Memories. They say every portrait is a trap, that a likeness drawn with care doesn't merely resemble, but holds, preserves, even steals something of the sitter. Some painters know this instinctively and shy away from perfect realism, letting their brush falter. Others lean into it, knowingly or not, their art becoming a cage of pigment and memory. Emma had never thought of her work that way. She was 26, quiet and happiest with charcoal smudges across her fingers, oil stains on her jeans. She lived in a small loft that smelled perpetually of turpentine and coffee, its walls lined with canvases she could not bring herself to sell. People said her portraits breathed. That was the word most often used, alive. Not beautiful, not skilled, but alive. And though the compliment pleased her at first, it had grown strange in her ears, unsettling, as though her gift had crossed into something she hadn't intended. Most of her commissions came from families who wanted her to paint from photographs, old pictures, sometimes sepia, sometimes Polaroids faded at the edges. She enjoyed these most of all. Photographs froze, but painting gave them motion again. Let her imagine the light that had once touched the subject's skin, the air they had once breathed. It was a rainy Thursday when she received the envelope that would change everything. No email, no phone call, just a thick paper envelope, slipped under her door while she slept. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, curling at the edges, grainy with age. It showed a young woman standing in front of a house that Emma didn't recognize, dressed in a plain blouse and skirt, hair pinned in a style that belonged to another century. The woman's eyes were dark, her smile faint, but there was something about the way she faced the camera, as if she knew it was not merely capturing her likeness but demanding it. There was no note, no name, no instructions, only the photograph. Emma turned it over in her hands again and again, searching for a signature or scrawl of identification. Nothing. She should have ignored it, she told herself. She had other commissions waiting, bills to pay, deadlines looming. Yet she found herself setting the photograph carefully on her easel as though it had already claimed the space. By afternoon, she had sketched the first lines. Her hand moved strangely. Normally she began with broad strokes, mapping shadows, establishing form. But this time, her charcoal traced the eyes first. Dark, oval, fixed. When she paused, she found them watching her from the paper, sharper than the faded original. She frowned, rubbed at the lines to soften them, but the gaze persisted, etched stubbornly into the fibers. She worked late into the night. Rain hammered against the windows, dripping through the sill where the frame had warped. Her lamp burned with a weak, yellow glow, shadows creeping along the floor. The building around her was quiet, her neighbors gone or sleeping, leaving her alone with the slow scrape of brush against canvas. It was after midnight when she noticed something strange. The photograph was changing. Not drastically, not impossibly, but enough that when she glanced back, the woman's smile seemed broader, her eyes clearer, as though the act of painting had polished the image itself. Emma blinked hard, rubbed her tired eyes, looked again. The photo was as it had been, grainy, faint, and yet she could not shake the feeling that each hour spent painting sharpened the subject not only on her canvas, but in the faded paper too. She tried to laugh it off. Fatigue, imagination. She'd worked too many hours, but when she finally collapsed into bed, sleep offered no escape. She dreamed of standing in a street she did not know, cobblestones slick with rain, gas lamps glowing dimly through fog. The air was cool against her skin, but her body felt different, heavier. She looked down and saw hands that weren't hers, slender, pale, ink-stained. She wore a skirt, a blouse, shoes she had never owned. When she lifted her gaze, people passed her on the street. They nodded. Some even greeted her by name, though she could not make out the word. She woke with a start, chest pounding. Her own apartment walls surrounded her again. The canvas loomed across the room, half finished, the woman's face emerging from strokes of oil, and for one dizzying moment, Emma thought she saw the painted lips curve wider than she had left them. Morning brought little comfort. The photograph still lay on the easel, unchanged, yet sharper in ways she could not articulate. She poured coffee, tried to distract herself with other projects, but her hand strayed back to the brush, back to the canvas. Each stroke brought more of the woman to life. Each hour blurred Emma's sense of self. By the third night, the dreams deepened. She no longer drifted through as a stranger. She lived them. She knew the weight of the skirt at her knees, the smell of coal smoke in the street, the scrape of wooden chairs in a crowded cafe. She heard conversations, voices calling her name, voices she almost recognized. She answered without thinking. She laughed in a timbre that was not her own. And when she woke, the details lingered, not like fading dream fragments, but like real memories. She could describe the taste of coffee served in cracked porcelain cups. She could recall the weather of a city that no longer existed. Her logbook, where she normally scribbled notes about colors and textures, began to fill with names she didn't know, places she had never been. Her handwriting shifted subtly, looping more elegantly, resembling the script of another era. She stared at the pages in horror, fingers trembling, but could not deny they felt natural. The painting grew almost on its own. She would step away, return, and find details she hadn't meant to add. The faint curl of hair at the woman's temple, the crease of fabric in her blouse, the glint in her eyes. Sometimes her brush moved without conscious thought, as though guided by another hand. By the end of the week, the portrait was nearly complete. The woman stared out with uncanny vitality, her expression alive, her gaze heavy. Emma felt no triumph, only dread, because she had begun to forget. At first it was small things where she had set her keys, whether she had eaten, the face of a neighbor she'd greeted for months. Then came larger blanks, conversations she swore she hadn't had, errands she didn't remember running, memories of her own childhood turning foggy while new memories of the other life sharpened. She sat at the canvas one evening, brush hovering, hands shaking. She whispered to herself, desperate, "Who are you?" The painted lips seemed ready to answer. The days slipped from Emma like paint water down a drain, colors bleeding together, leaving only murk. She tried to cling to her routines. Coffee at the cracked kitchen counter, notes scribbled in her sketchbook, the hum of the radiator. But the more she painted, the less those details belonged to her. The loft grew foreign. Her hands no longer reached for mugs in their usual cupboard. Her feet carried her along paths she did not intend. As though muscle memory had been rewritten, the portrait dominated the room. What had begun as faint outlines now radiated presence, as though the woman inside the canvas had grown impatient, pressing against the surface of the paint to be seen. Emma could not look away for long. Even while cooking, even while brushing her teeth, she felt the tug of that gaze from across the loft, pulling her attention back like a magnet. She began hearing things. Not loud, not impossible, just faint details slipping into her awareness at the edges of silence. A carriage rattling across cobblestones when the street outside was empty asphalt. A clock chiming the hour in a tone she did not own. A child's laughter echoing faintly through walls too thin to hold it. At first she jolted, startled, but soon the sounds became background, as if the loft itself had shifted into another time. Her sketchbook filled itself in ways she couldn't explain. She would leave it blank on the desk at night and wake to find pages covered in ink, names sprawled in looping cursive, sometimes repeated obsessively. Clara, Clara, Clara. Streets she had never walked. Rue des Ombres, Market Lane, Ashford Square. Phrases and languages she didn't speak. Once, a charcoal sketch of a hand holding a brush that looked exactly like hers, but the sleeve belonged to another era. Lace-trimmed, delicate. Emma stopped bringing in new commissions. She ignored calls, deleted emails without opening them. Clients grew impatient, but she could not explain that she no longer had room for their faces. Her every waking moment belonged to the stranger on the canvas, whose features grew sharper each day. And at night, always at night, Emma lived someone else's life. She dreamed, though they no longer felt like dreams. She stood in a studio filled with the smell of linseed oil, heard the scrape of a chair across wooden floorboards, felt the weight of an easel roughed beneath her palms. She painted portraits of strangers who smiled stiffly, blinked too rarely, who seemed uneasy beneath her gaze. In these dreams, her hands never trembled. Her strokes were confident, assured, guided by decades of skill. She signed each canvas with a name she could never quite see, the letters curling out of reach before she could read them. When she woke, her hands carried the memory of those movements, finishing details she had not begun, adding depth she could not recall intending. She watched herself paint sometimes, detached, as though her body belonged to another. The forgetting worsened. Her own name slipped once when she introduced herself to a neighbor. She opened her mouth to say Emma, but another name spilled out Clara. The neighbor frowned, confused, and Emma stumbled through an apology, cheeks burning. But later, staring at the mirror above her sink, she whispered it again, rolling the syllables on her tongue. Clara. The sound felt heavier, truer, as though her real name had been buried, and only now clawed free. Her reflection unsettled her. Not drastically, not grotesquely, but subtly. She thought her hair seemed darker, her jawline sharper, her eyes more shadowed than they had been weeks ago. She brushed it off as fatigue, poor lighting, paranoia. But sometimes, catching herself in a window at night, she swore she saw not her face at all, but the face from the portrait, staring back with that faint, knowing smile. She tried once to cover the painting, to drape a cloth over the canvas and banish the gaze. For a night she slept easier, the loft dimmer, quieter, but in the morning the cloth lay crumpled on the floor, the portrait bare, and the smile seemed broader than before. She did not remember removing it. Her dreams grew darker. The studio where she painted grew empty of clients. Instead, strangers appeared in the background, half-formed, their faces blurred as though memory had erased them. They whispered from the corners, too faint to understand. The whispers followed her into waking. By the second week, she realized she had begun losing her own past. She tried to remember her mother's voice, blank. Her father's laugh, nothing. The smell of her childhood bedroom, gone. She flipped through old photographs, desperate, but the faces looked like strangers. She traced her finger over them, whispering their names, but no recognition stirred. The memories had been pushed out, overwritten by those of another life. She could recall instead the layout of a house she had never lived in, the sound of a dog barking in a garden she had never walked, the bitterness of tea brewed in a chipped porcelain pot that she had never owned. One evening, exhausted, Emma sat before the canvas and begged aloud, "Please, stop. Whoever you are, whatever this is, stop." Her voice cracked, hollow in the empty loft. The painted woman gazed back in silence. But Emma could not shake the impression that the corners of her mouth trembled upward, amused. That night's dream was the clearest yet. She sat at the canvas in another body, brush steady, painting with strokes that did not belong to her. When she stepped back, she saw what she had made. Not a stranger's portrait this time, but her own face, rendered in perfect, uncanny detail. Her heart jolted in her chest. She tried to move, tried to turn away, but the painted eyes followed her, alive, heavy with knowledge. She woke gasping, sweat cold on her skin, sheets twisted around her limbs. The loft loomed around her in shadows, but something was wrong. The photograph, the original faded print that had arrived in the envelope. She stumbled toward the easel, heart pounding, and held it under the lamplight. It had changed. The edges were sharper, the eyes clearer, the faint smile more distinct. And beneath the photograph, faint but visible, a new figure had begun to emerge behind the woman, in the background of the house, not part of the original photo. A blur, a figure that looked uncannily like Emma herself. She dropped the photo as though burned. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up, the woman's eyes fixed on her from below. The portrait towered above, nearly finished now. The paint so fresh it seemed to glisten, though the brush had dried hours ago. Emma sank into the chair before it, trembling, realization dawning with sick weight. She was not painting the woman into life. The woman was painting herself through Emma, brushstroke by brushstroke, memory by memory, until there would be nothing left of Emma at all, and the canvas would not hold just one likeness when finished. It would hold two. The city outside Emma's loft had not changed, and yet she no longer recognized it. The streets blurred into fog whenever she stepped out, storefronts shifting, neighbors' faces dissolving into anonymity. She tried to go about her errands, to buy bread from the corner shop, to stop by the post office, but her body betrayed her. Her feet turned corners she did not choose, carrying her down alleys that no longer belonged to the present. More than once she found herself standing in front of a wall that should have been a street, breathless, as if the world itself had shifted behind her back. So she stopped going out. The loft became her whole world, and in that world, the portrait reigned. It leaned from its easel like a sentinel, the woman's painted eyes fixed on her no matter where she moved. Emma tried draping cloth over it again, pinning the edges this time, weighing them down with books. By morning, the cloth was gone, folded neatly across the chair. The portrait stared at her with sharper detail, as though mocking her attempt to deny it. The photograph, too, had changed. What had once been a faded print now bore lines so crisp they looked new, as though developed yesterday, and the blurred figure in the background had grown clearer. A young woman with loose hair, standing half in shadow. Emma. She stopped touching the photo, but it was always near slipped into her sketchbook, tucked inside her pocket, propped against the sink while she brushed her teeth. She no longer believed she misplaced it. She believed the photo placed itself. Nights belonged to Clara. That was the name she could no longer deny. The dreams no longer felt borrowed. They felt like home. She walked streets lit by gas lamps, heard the creak of horse-drawn carts, smelled the coal smoke drifting from chimneys. She knew the cracked step on the stairwell of the boarding house she lived in. She knew the scrape of her brush across coarse canvas, the way paint clung differently in another century. She laughed with friends in cafes, though their faces blurred when she woke, leaving only their voices behind. The worst part was not the dreams. It was the forgetting. Emma's own past grew thinner, dissolving like watercolor in the rain. Her mother's face slipped from her. The sound of her father's voice vanished. Photographs on her phone looked like strangers, their names sitting heavy and useless beneath images she could not place. She scrolled for hours, panicked, trying to anchor herself, but the faces only slid away faster. In their place, Clara's life solidified. Emma could recall the street names of Clara's city better than her own neighborhood. She remembered the taste of tea steeped too long in iron kettles. She remembered arguments with a landlord over rent, remembered the cold draft through the studio windows, remembered standing at an easel until her back ached, while the world outside dimmed. Emma wrote frantically in her notebook, desperate to prove she still existed. She listed her birthday, her favorite books, the color of her childhood room, but by the next morning, the handwriting had shifted, loops longer, flourishes sharper, words crossed out and replaced with Clara's memories instead. The notebook no longer obeyed her. One evening, she caught her reflection in the window. The glass showed her loft faintly, but the face staring back was not her own. The hair darker, the eyes older. the mouth curved in that faint, amused smile she knew too well. She pressed her palms to her cheeks, whispering her own name, Emma, 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 but the reflection mouthed another, Clara. The canvas seemed to breathe behind her. She turned sharply, heart hammering. The portrait had changed again. The woman Clara was no longer alone in the painting. Behind her, faint at first but undeniable, a second figure was taking shape. A younger woman, shoulders sloped, hair falling forward, a brush clutched loosely in her hand. Emma, painted into the same frame, her stomach dropped. She staggered forward, nearly knocking the easel. Her brush lay on the table, bristles stiff with dried paint, though she did not remember lifting it since yesterday. And yet the strokes were fresh, wet, as if added moments ago. Her breath came fast, shallow. No, she whispered, though she did not know if she was denying Clara or herself. The dreams pressed harder that night. Emma stood in Clara's studio, painting late into the evening, the lamplight trembling with each flicker of oil. But when she turned to the canvas, she saw not a stranger but herself, her own face taking form, each stroke adding detail she had not chosen. Clara painted Emma, and Emma painted Clara, brush strokes looping endlessly, each hand guided by the other. The memory carried into waking. She jolted upright, hands aching, fingernails crusted with dry pigment though she had not touched her paints. The canvas before her now bore both figures fully, Clara in the foreground, Emma behind, their gazes fixed outward in perfect symmetry. Emma stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on her face, gripping the sink until her knuckles whitened. She raised her eyes to the mirror and saw Clara's face staring back, not for a flicker, not for an instant, but steady, patient, certain. Her scream broke the loft's silence, echoing against the walls, but the sound was not entirely hers. Another voice layered beneath it, rising from her throat, older, deeper, Clara's. She collapsed onto the floor, rocking, clutching her head. The laughter of unseen voices circled her, the whispers she could never catch now rising in chorus. They did not taunt, they welcomed. When she finally dared look up, the photograph lay on the floor beside her. Two women now stood in the frame, Clara in sharp detail, Emma behind her, blurred but solidifying. Emma understood then. This was not a haunting, not possession. It was a relay, a handoff across time. Each portrait passed to another artist, each likeness carrying the weight of two lives until the painter no longer knew which memories were theirs. Clara had been painted once, just as Emma was now, and now Clara painted through her. Emma rose slowly, legs trembling, drawn back to the canvas, as though nothing else existed. She reached for the brush, with hands that shook, but did not resist. The bristles touched paint, then canvas, completing a line along Clara's collar. The stroke was steady, assured, nothing like Emma's usual hesitance. She whispered her own name again, but the sound caught in her throat. Another name slipped free instead, low and certain, carried on her breath. Clara. The portrait smiled. Emma no longer kept track of days. Time had flattened, reduced to the alternating rhythm of brushstroke and dream. The calendar above her desk hung untouched, pages curling, numbers meaningless. Outside her window, the city went on cars, people, neon lights, but none of it belonged to her anymore. Her world was the canvas, and the woman within it who now stood as clearly as any living person. Clara. The name had taken root so deeply that Emma could no longer hear it as foreign. When she whispered it, her lips shaped the syllables with familiarity, as though speaking her own. When she woke in the night, breath caught in her throat. It was Clara's memories that soothed her back into calm. The sound of gas lamps hissing in the fog, the comfort of wool gloves in winter, the creak of stairs in a boarding house long since demolished. Her own memories, by contrast, scattered like startled birds. Childhood birthdays, school corridors, the warmth of her mother's hug, these were now only echoes, fading photographs, blurred beyond recognition. She knew they had once been hers, but they no longer carried weight. When she tried to summon her father's face, another man appeared instead, Clara's father, with spectacles perched low on his nose, frowning as he balanced the household accounts. The canvas was nearly finished. Two figures stared outward now, their features sharp as reality. Clara in the foreground, luminous, her faint smile carrying quiet triumph. And behind her, Emma, though, already the lines seemed to soften, as if her presence were fading from the paint itself. The brush strokes that had once defined her cheekbone now blurred into the background, like mist dissipating at dawn. Clara was claiming the frame. Emma resisted, but weakly. She avoided mirrors, though every reflection betrayed her. In the window glass, in the shine of a kettle, she no longer found her own face. Clara's eyes looked back instead, calm, patient, certain. Sometimes Emma touched her own skin, tracing jaw and brow, desperate to feel bone and flesh beneath her fingertips. But even her touch felt borrowed. One night, desperate, she searched the internet for Clara. Typing the name felt absurd, like trying to catalog a ghost. But she combed through archives, genealogy sites, scans of old newspapers. Hours passed, screen light bleaching her skin, until she found it. A fragment of an article from the 1920 seconds, digitized poorly, words blurred. Clara Marchand, a painter of unusual talent, vanished from her studio in 1923, last seen working on a commissioned portrait. Neither her family nor her colleagues ever discovered her fate. Only her unfinished canvas remained. Emma's blood chilled. She clicked through, but there was nothing more. The record ended abruptly, as if history itself had swallowed Clara whole. She sat in the glow of the monitor, heart pounding, staring at the unfinished portrait in her own loft. It was not coincidence. Clara had not vanished. Clara had simply crossed. Emma staggered back from the easel, palms slick with sweat. She tried to shove the canvas over, to break it, to tear it from its frame, but her body betrayed her. The brush was already in her hand, the bristles wet with paint she did not remember dipping. Her arm moved in slow, graceful arcs, guided not by panic but by steady certainty. The stroke curved along Clara's sleeve, darkening the shadow, perfecting it. Emma screamed inside, but the sound never reached her throat. The brush continued. The portrait glowed with completion. The dreams that night were not dreams at all. She was Clara fully, walking the damp streets of a city where Emma had never lived. Friends greeted her. A landlord scowled at her lateness with rent. Clients posed stiffly as she worked, their eyes flicking nervously toward her brush. And when she looked down, her hands were not Emma's, they were Clara's, veined and pale, scarred with years of painting. When she woke, the loft was gone. She stood in the old studio instead. High windows streaked with rain, wooden beams overhead, the smell of turpentine and soot. For a moment she believed she had finally crossed fully, that Emma's life was a discarded husk. Relief mingled with terror, but then the walls shimmered. The loft returned. She was in both places at once, slipping between them like paint bleeding across water. Her logbook recorded the change. In the morning she found it filled with Clara's handwriting, page after page describing Emma. Her hair, her eyes, her small loft, her modern paints. Clara was documenting Emma even as Emma painted Clara. It was not possession, it was exchange. And the exchange was almost complete. Emma tried to fight. She smashed her phone, tore her photographs, ripped open drawers to scatter everything she owned. But the portrait endured, unshaken, unbothered. The smile on Clara's painted face deepened. The figure of Emma in the background blurred further, almost invisible now, as though the paint itself could not hold her. That night, Emma dreamed of an unfinished canvas. Clara stood behind her, brush in hand, painting her face with steady patience. Emma tried to run, but the floor stretched. The air thickened. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Clara's brush pressed against her cheek, and with each stroke Emma felt her body grow fainter, her outline dissolving. When she jolted awake, she was holding the brush. Her hand was steady, too steady. The lines she painted were not her own. The canvas glistened. Clara's portrait was complete. Emma stared at it for a long time, heart hollow, mind fraying. The woman in the painting smiled, eyes bright, alive. Emma's own figure had vanished entirely, erased as though it had never been painted. She stumbled to the mirror above her sink, desperate for proof that she still existed. The reflection gazed back calmly, lips curved, eyes dark. Clara's face, not Emma's. And when she whispered her name, only one word escaped her lips. Clara. The loft seemed to sigh in relief. Emma no longer counted the days she had left. Each sunrise brought less of her back, Each sunset returned more of Clara. The loft felt smaller now, its walls pressing in as though the room itself belonged to another time. Even her body betrayed her. Her reflection moved with a grace she did not command. Her handwriting curled into flourishes she had never practiced. Her voice slipped into accents she could not claim. At first she had screamed. She had fought smashing brushes, tearing canvases, even trying to set fire to the portrait itself. The flame caught for a moment, orange licking at the edges, but the smoke thickened until she could no longer breathe. And when she staggered back, gasping for air, the canvas was untouched. Its colors were more vivid than ever, Clara's eyes brighter, her smile wider, as if the attempt at destruction had only fed it. Emma's strength vanished. Sleep overtook her at the easel, body slumped forward, yet the brush never left her hand. In the morning she would wake to find new strokes she had no memory of making, details perfected, the soft shine of Clara's hair, the delicate shadow beneath her chin, the faint light in her eyes. The painting was not only alive, it was completing itself through her. The photograph confirmed the truth. Once a faded image of a single woman before a forgotten house, it now showed more figures. Clara, sharp and clear, Emma behind her, blurred but fading fast, and behind Emma, another figure had appeared, a man in an old waistcoat, brush in hand, eyes hollow, then another behind him, and another. The photograph was not fixed. It was an archive, a chain of painters, each caught in their moment of surrender, each erased in turn. Emma clutched the photo, heart hammering, but her hands shook so violently it slipped to the floor. She left it there, unable to pick it up again. She no longer wanted proof. Nights dissolved into waking dreams. She wandered streets cobbled and damp, gas lamps casting halos in the fog. She lived in Clara's studio, felt the ache in Clara's shoulders after hours at the easel, smelled the coal smoke that clung to Clara's hair, and when she turned to her canvases, she painted Emma, not deliberately, not with choice, but with inevitability. The cycle was clear now. The portrait was never the end. It was the door. Each finished canvas opened into another, and the painter walked through, carrying the next victim inside. Clara had been consumed once, long ago. Now she had clawed her way back into Emma's flesh, and Emma's place was behind her, waiting to be painted for the next to claim. The realization did not bring resistance. It brought exhaustion. Emma stood before the canvas one last night, brush steady in her hand, watching as Clara's features glistened with completion. She whispered her name, soft, uncertain, Emma, but the word dissolved, empty, meaningless. Her lips curved instead into the familiar smile, and the name that answered filled the room. Clara. The brush moved, finishing the last line. The portrait exhaled. For a moment, Emma swore she heard the creak of boards, the sigh of cloth, the rustle of a figure stepping free of paint. Clara had crossed fully, claiming flesh, breath, voice. Emma stumbled back, heart hammering, but her feet no longer obeyed. She sank into the chair as if rooted there. The world dimmed, her vision blurred, and she felt herself sliding, slipping, not into sleep but into the canvas itself. The smell of oil surrounded her, the texture of linen pressed against her skin. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound flattened into pigment, trapped behind the gloss of drying varnish. From the easel, Clara smiled outward, radiant, alive. And within the portrait's background, barely visible, a new figure emerged. A woman with hair falling loose, shoulders sloped, brush in hand, mouth open in a silent cry. Emma, already fading into the painted grain, already blurring for the next to take her place. The loft grew still, brushes dried, the canvas gleamed. The photograph on the floor curled at the edges, capturing the new addition with quiet inevitability. Another name etched itself into the chain, another life bound. Emma was gone, and Clara, now breathing again in the world of flesh, turned her gaze toward the unfinished canvases stacked in the corner, already searching for her next subject. Story 5. The Toymaker's Last Gift. The memory fades like the paint on a child's toy left too long in the sundae. At first only the bright edges dull, then the details vanish, and finally the shape itself is forgotten, leaving only a hollow where something beloved used to be. In a quiet workshop at the end of a narrow street, An old man sat surrounded by shelves of toys that had long outlived their owners. Wooden horses with chipped legs, puppets with tangled strings, soldiers carved from pine, their paint flaking, their faces worn smooth by decades of small hands. The air smelled of sawdust and oil, of varnish and time. His name was Elias. Few remembered it. Fewer spoke it. To the town, he was simply the toy maker. For more than 60 years, he had built joy into shapes of wood and cloth. Children once pressed their noses against his shop windows, eyes wide at dolls that blinked, at music boxes that spun, at trains that chugged with clockwork precision. But children grew, parents moved, and the street fell quiet. Now Elias worked alone, his wife long buried, his children scattered, his friends gone. Even his own memory betrayed him. Alzheimer's, the doctor had called it. A thief that came not with knives but with soft fingers, stealing moments piece by piece. Some mornings Elias woke unsure of his own name. Some nights he wandered rooms he had lived in for decades, unsure which door led to bed. He had forgotten the faces of many who once loved him. He had forgotten birthdays, promises, whole years. And yet his hands remembered. Even when his mind faltered, when words slipped through his grasp, his fingers remained steady. They knew the weight of a chisel, the angle of a knife, the rhythm of sandpaper. It was as though his craft lived deeper than memory, etched into muscle and bone. So he built, day after day. Elias sat at his bench, shaping wood that no child would ever play with, toys that would gather dust until someone someday threw them away. But the act of building soothed him, anchored him, reminded him he was still himself, at least while the tools were in his grip. And then, one winter evening, he began his final toy. He did not plan it. His memory had grown too ragged for plans. But when his hands reached for the block of maple, when the chisel bit into its surface, something guided him. A shape revealed itself slowly, deliberate, inevitable. At first it seemed to be a doll. He had carved many before, but this one grew different. The limbs were jointed oddly, the sockets cut deeper, allowing for movements that no ordinary toy required. The torso was segmented, its spine flexible, bending more naturally than wood should. The head took shape last round, hollow, its eyes not painted but made of glass, sharp and reflective. Elias frowned often, muttering, pausing, asking aloud, "Why this way? Why like this?" But his hands did not stop. They moved with certainty even when his mind lagged behind. By the end of the week, the doll sat upright on his workbench. Its body gleamed with varnish, its glass eyes catching the lamplight with unsettling clarity. It did not smile. Its wooden lips were thin, closed, waiting. Elias stared at it for a long time. He felt pride, yes, but also unease. The toy was unlike anything he had made. It seemed less a plaything than a companion, a witness, a presence. That night, as he locked the workshop and shuffled to bed, he glanced back once more. The doll remained at the bench, silent, still. Yet he could not shake the feeling that its glass eyes followed him out. The dreams began soon after. Elias found himself underground, in a narrow wooden box. The air was close, heavy, filled with the scent of earth. He tried to move, but his arms were stiff, his legs unresponsive. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, smothered by layers of soil. Above him he heard voices, familiar voices, whispering, hurried, cruel. He could not make out the words, only the tones, his children's voices. He woke gasping, nails digging into his palms, sweat soaking his shirt. His workshop lamp still glowed. The doll sat on the bench where he had left it, but its hands were different now. The wooden fingers had shifted. They were curled into shapes, stiff but unmistakable. Letters, Elias, his name. The old man staggered backward, heart pounding. His mind faltered, tried to dismiss it. Perhaps he had carved them so, forgotten in his confusion. But the joints were fresh, the angles too precise to be accident. He sat heavily in his chair, trembling, watching the doll's fingers. They did not move again, yet he felt sure they would, in time. The days that followed blurred. Elias forgot meals, forgot names, forgot to change his clothes. But he never forgot the doll. His eyes sought it constantly, as if tethered. Each night the dreams deepened. The wooden box, the muffled cries, the whispers of betrayal. Each morning, the doll's hands spelled more, finger joints clacking faintly into place like keys on a typewriter. Help, buried, box. The words chilled him. They were not toys. They were messages. Elias tried to ignore them. He tried to tell himself it was illness, hallucination, the collapse of a failing mind. But the whispers in his sleep told otherwise. And sometimes, when he woke in the dead of night, the doll's glass eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting not the lamp, but something deeper, something alive. The toy maker's last gift was not meant for children. It was meant for him. Elias did not sleep well anymore. The nights pressed down on him like a lid, and the dreams returned with merciless regularity. Each dream began the same. Darkness, the smell of earth, the rough interior of wood against his skin. He was lying in a box, narrow and confining, and above him came the indistinct murmur of voices. Sometimes they sounded like strangers, but most often they sounded like his own children. Familiar tones turned sharp, hurried, deliberate. He would wake, gasping, clawing at his sheets, only to see the doll waiting on the workbench. Its eyes shone faintly in the lamplight, its limbs frozen in strange positions. But the fingers, those damned fingers, were never still. The first time he noticed, they had bent into the shape of his name, not spelled letter by letter in the air, but twisted just enough that when his eyes followed the sequence of angles, the message was unmistakable. Elias. He had laughed then, a weak, trembling sound. Perhaps he had carved them this way unconsciously. Perhaps the disease was playing tricks again. But the next morning, new words had formed. The joints of the doll's hands folded awkwardly inward, thumbs pressed against wooden palms, forefingers jutting straight like pointers. The arrangement made no sense as play, no sense as design. And yet, when he stared long enough, the shapes aligned into meaning. Help. Elias staggered back, clutching his head. He tried to tell himself it was his failing memory arranging nonsense into patterns. But night after night, the doll repeated itself, the fingers shifting silently when he wasn't looking, forming new phrases. Buried. In. Box. His chest tightened with recognition he didn't want to feel, because those were the very images that haunted his dreams. His family, their muffled voices, the sensation of earth pressing above him, the impossibility of breath. He wanted to throw the doll into the fire, to smash it with a hammer, to rid himself of its glass-eyed stare. But each time the thought crossed his mind, his hands froze. He could not bring them down on the wood. It was as though the toy had threaded invisible strings through his muscles, halting his violence. Instead, he sat for hours, watching, and the doll spoke more clearly, not with voice, never with sound, but with movement. Fingers bent, held, rearranged, a slow, patient alphabet. His failing mind strained to keep pace, but when he finally understood, the meaning chilled him. They put me here. Family. Betrayal. Elias pressed his palms to his temples, muttering, No, no, not them. He remembered nothing clearly anymore, but he clung to the idea that his children had once loved him, that their visits, though fewer with the years, had been real. Yet the doll told otherwise, and deep within his gut, he felt a shard of memory break loose in argument, harsh words about inheritance, about his failing mind, about being more burdened than father. Another night, the doll's fingers twisted into a long, jagged sequence, slower than before, as though savoring each word. Elias forced himself to watch. They killed me. I was Elias. The old man nearly collapsed. His breath came in ragged sobs, eyes burning with tears. But I am Elias, he whispered. I'm still here. The doll stilled. Then its fingers bent again, joints creaking faintly in the silence of the workshop. Not for long. The words sank into him heavier than stone. After that, Elias could not avoid the truth. His hands, though steady, no longer felt entirely his. Each time he sat at the bench, they moved with more certainty, as though guided by another. He would drift in thought, only to return and find new carvings on scraps of wood, tiny coffins, rough figurines of people he half recognized. He didn't remember making them, yet the shavings on the floor betrayed his hand. The doll seemed pleased. Its glass eyes gleamed brighter each night, catching even the faintest light, as though something inside them burned. Its limbs shifted more freely, no longer waiting for long pauses, but twitching when he turned his head. arranging themselves with quiet precision. Elias began to feel he was the toy, and the doll the maker. He avoided sleep, terrified of the box that waited in his dreams. But exhaustion always won, and the dreams worsened. He no longer only lay inside the coffin, he felt the nails being driven in, heard the hammer blows, smelled the pine sap in the fresh boards. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by dirt. He woke once with his nails cracked and bleeding, as though he had clawed at something harder than sheets. And on the workbench, the doll's hand spelled 3 new words. They buried you. Elias stared at the message until his vision blurred, until tears streaked his cheeks. He whispered to the empty room. Then, what am I now? The doll's glass eyes caught the lamplight. Its head tilted just enough to suggest amusement. And then slowly its fingers moved again. You are what's left. The words echoed in his mind long after the joints returned to stillness. He sat slumped in his chair, surrounded by toys that had outlived their children, realizing he was one of them now, an object, forgotten, stored away. Only this toy, his last, was not meant for play. It was meant to remember what he could not. To finish the story his mind had been too broken to hold, and it had only begun. The workshop had become a tomb. The air was thick with dust and oil, the curtains drawn, the street outside forgotten. Elias rarely left his bench now, as if some invisible tether bound him to that narrow circle of lamplight. The shelves of toys watched with hollow patience, and at the center of it all sat the doll, motionless yet never still. He tried to ignore it. He told himself to work on something else, another horse, another soldier, something to keep the routine alive. But the wood refused him. His chisels dulled. His hands shook when he strayed from the doll. The only time they steadied was when he returned to its presence, watching the subtle shifts of its fingers, waiting for the next arrangement. And always, it gave him more. The words formed slowly, joints creaking, hands folding with an unnatural grace. Elias stared, translating shapes into letters, letters into sentences, sentences into memory. They lowered you into the ground. You begged. They did not listen. The old man whimpered, clutching his chest. No, no, my children loved me. They wouldn't, but the doll did not pause. They nailed the box shut. They laughed when the dirt fell. Each word was a nail driven into his mind. He shook his head violently, as if motion might scatter them like cobwebs. Yet in his dreams he had felt it, the press of boards against his ribs, the weight of soil above, the muffled scrape of shovels fading as the last light disappeared, and the doll was not finished. One night he woke at his bench, unsure when sleep had taken him. The lamp had burned low, flames stuttering, shadows crawling. He lifted his eyes, and the doll's hands had shifted again. You clawed, you screamed, no one came. Oh, Elias raised his own trembling fingers, staring at the cracked nails, the dried blood at their edges. He remembered nothing, yet the evidence betrayed him. He pressed his palms to his face and wept, the sobs shaking through brittle bones. But the doll's message continued, merciless. You died alone. You were forgotten. The words seared into him. He tried to rise, to leave the workshop, to escape the sight of the thing. But his body betrayed him. His legs stiffened, his knees locked. He collapsed back into the chair, panting, while the doll stared on. It was then he realized. He could not remember how he had arrived here at all. When had he last walked the street outside? When had he last spoken to another living soul? The memories were thin, full of holes. His children's faces slipped away like mist, their names dissolving before he could grasp them. All that remained vivid was the box, the dirt, the betrayal, and the doll. Always the doll. Its eyes gleamed brighter with each passing day, not reflections of the lamp, no, something deeper, as if the glass itself held a flame. When Elias stared too long, he saw things flickering inside, the blur of trees seen from beneath the earth, the flicker of faces leaning over a grave, the darkness of soil collapsing. The doll's hands moved again, slowly, patiently, as if savoring each revelation. You are not Elias anymore. He froze, the words ringing louder than any before. His throat tightened, words caught. Then, what am I? The doll tilted its head, glass eyes catching his reflection, warped and small. Its fingers twitched. You are what remains. You are memory. You are mine. The air thickened. Elias gasped, clutching his chest. He tried to summon the strength to argue, to assert his existence, but the truth was undeniable. His body no longer felt solid. His hands blurred at their edges, his breath shallow and uncertain. When he pressed his palm to the table, it left no warmth, no mark. He looked at the doll, horror dawning. "You've taken me," he whispered. The joints creaked again. "I remembered you. No one else did." The realization struck harder than the betrayal. His family had forgotten. The world had moved on. Even his mind had failed him. Only the doll, his last creation, had preserved the truth. It had shaped his death into language, carved his memory into permanence. He was alive only because it remembered, and that meant he was bound to it. The days that followed blurred into a cycle. He drifted in and out of waking, unsure when dreams ended, and the workshop began. Sometimes he saw the coffin again, nails above him, dirt pressing close. Sometimes he saw the bench, the doll perched with glass eyes glowing. Sometimes the two blended, and he found himself trapped in both buried and watching himself be buried. The doll never ceased its messages. Each night more words came, crawling through his vision like cracks in glass. They spoke of his family's greed, of arguments he could not recall, of signatures on documents he never saw. They had ended his life while his mind faltered, convinced he no longer knew enough to resist. "You were betrayed," the doll reminded him. "You were buried, and now you live in me." Elias screamed, pounded his fists on the table, begged for silence. But the doll was tireless. It had become his mouth, his memory, his prison, and slowly, he began to believe the worst truth of all. Perhaps he had never left that box. Perhaps this workshop was only the dream of a dying mind, the illusion of a craftsman too stubborn to fade. Perhaps the doll was all that remained: wood, glass, and the echo of his soul clinging desperately to the last thing his hands had made. When the thought settled, his chest grew cold, his body lighter. He looked down at his hands and saw them blur, faint, as though carved from mist. Across the bench, the doll's lips parted for the first time. Only a fraction, only enough to suggest breath. Its fingers spelled one final phrase that night: "You are the toy now." The workshop had become a cage of shadows. Every night, when the lamp guttered low and the street outside slipped into silence, Elias felt the edges of himself thinning further, his body dissolving into a haze. He no longer trusted his reflection. In the dusty mirror above the sink, he caught only flickers of movement, a face that was not entirely his. The eyes were glassy, reflective, hollow. The doll sat where it always had, perched on the bench like a sentinel, yet it no longer seemed content to sit. Its joints twitched faintly when the room grew still, wood creaking as if stretching after years of slumber. Its hands no longer spelled only words, sometimes they flexed in rhythms, tapping the tabletop like a coded heartbeat. Elias watched, powerless. He understood now. He was no longer the man at the bench. He was inside the doll, trapped behind glass eyes, clinging to fragments of thought that grew dimmer with each passing hour. His voice, his memory, his soul, they had bled into the last thing he created. At first he tried to resist. He screamed within, tried to move his limbs, to prove he was still flesh. But the body that had once been Elias moved sluggishly, as if drugged, fading. His hands no longer gripped tools. They trembled in his lap, forgotten. When he tried to rise, his knees buckled. He understood then. The body was failing, but the doll was not. And the doll had learned to move. One evening he woke, or thought he did, to the sound of soft footsteps. He blinked, disoriented. The workshop door creaked open, though he had not unlocked it. A figure entered, hesitant. A child, perhaps 10 years old, peered into the lamplight, clutching a small wooden horse missing one wheel. "Hello?" the boy whispered, eyes wide. Elias tried to speak, to warn him, to drive him away. His lips did not move, only silence pressed from his throat. The doll turned its head, slowly, deliberately, its glass eyes fixed on the boy. The child gasped, startled. It moved. He stepped closer, fascinated, as children always were with toys that seemed alive. "Did you make it? Does it work?" Inside the doll, Elias screamed. He tried to slam the wooden arms against the bench, tried to spell warnings with its fingers. But the will was not his anymore. The joints bent smoothly, not into words of warning, but into greeting. The doll's hand lifted in a delicate wave. The boy's face lit up. He giggled nervously, edging closer. Can it talk? The doll's jaw creaked. The lips parted just enough for sound to seep through. Not speech, not yet, but a faint rasp like wood rubbed against stone. It was enough to make the boy gasp again, this time with delight. Wow, it's alive. The word struck Elias like a nail. Alive. Yes, the boy saw life in the doll, but not in him. Not in the frail husk of the toy maker slumped in the chair, nearly forgotten. All the boy's eyes cared for was the toy, gleaming, uncanny, awake. And Elias knew then that his last creation had outlived him. The boy returned the next evening, and the one after, always with wide eyes, always with another broken toy as excuse. Each time he lingered longer, watching the doll, speaking to it as if expecting answers. And each time, the doll responded more smoothly, tilting its head, flexing its fingers, tapping patterns on the wood. Elias clung to his dwindling presence, horrified. The boy did not understand what he was watching. He thought it a miracle of craft, a hidden mechanism, a secret machine. He did not know that within those joints pulsed memory, grief, betrayal. He did not know that a man's soul pressed against the glass of its eyes, screaming. The doll began to spell new words, but not for Elias, for the boy. Its fingers tapped against the bench in slow, deliberate rhythm, and the boy traced along eagerly, sounding out the message. My name is Elias. The boy frowned. Elias? That's you, isn't it? He looked toward the old man slumped in his chair. Elias tried to stir, to prove life, but his body betrayed him. His chest rose shallowly, his head lolled. The doll tapped again. No, I am Elias. The boy shivered, half thrilled, half afraid. You're him? But you're just a toy. The doll's head tilted, glass eyes flashing in the lamplight. Its fingers bent once more. They buried me. The boy's face paled. He glanced nervously at the old man, then back at the doll. Who buried you? The fingers flexed with patient certainty. Family. Elias raged inside, clawed at the walls of his prison. He wanted to stop the words, to spare the boy the truth, to keep his children's betrayal hidden in the grave where it belonged. But the doll no longer needed him. It had found another ear, another witness. The boy's visits grew longer, his questions deeper, and the doll answered all. Each night it told more of Elias's story, how the family had conspired, how they had lowered him into the ground while he begged for mercy, how they had walked away as the dirt closed in. The boy listened, rapt, horrified, yet unable to turn away. And with each retelling, Elias felt himself dimming, his thoughts blurred, his name frayed, until even inside the doll he no longer knew which part was him and which part was story. The doll did not falter. It remembered, and now it was preparing. One evening, when the boy left in a hurry, the doll's head turned back toward Elias's fading body. Its fingers curled into a final message just for him. You are finished. I will tell them all. The glass eyes gleamed, alive with something older than craft, deeper than memory. Elias trembled within, knowing at last that the toy was no longer his gift. It was his replacement. The workshop smelled of dust and endings. The shelves sagged with toys that would never again know laughter. The tools lay still, their edges dulled, their handles worn smooth by a lifetime of use. And in the center, under the dim circle of lamplight, two figures remained. The husk of the old man, head bowed, eyes clouded, and the doll, upright, luminous, waiting. Elias could no longer feel his body. The chair that had supported him for decades now seemed impossibly far, as if he had slipped from it entirely. His limbs were shadows, his breath a faint memory. He drifted behind glass, tethered only to the gleam of the doll's eyes. The boy came again, breath fogging in the winter air, wooden horse still clutched in his hand. He stopped short when he saw the toy maker's body, slumped unnaturally, lips parted in silence. Mister? He whispered. No answer came. He stepped closer, heart pounding, gaze darting between the still figure of the old man and the doll on the bench. And then, as if sensing the need, the doll moved. Its head turned, slow, deliberate, its hands unfolded, fingers bent into their patient alphabet, tapping against the wood in the rhythm the boy had learned. He is gone. The boy's eyes widened. His throat worked as if to cry out, but curiosity held him still. Gone? The doll's fingers shifted again, but I remain. The boy trembled. You're him. You're Elias. The glass eyes gleamed. Yes, and within that single word, Elias felt the last of himself dissolve. Not in denial, not in rage, only in surrender. He was memory now, housed in joints and glass, carried forward by wood and will. The doll continued, its hands spelling with eerie grace. They buried me. They betrayed me. I remember. The boy shivered but did not run. His small hand rested on the bench, inches from the doll's wooden fingers. Why are you telling me? The doll's head tilted. So you will tell others. The boy swallowed hard. He looked once more at the old man's still body, then back at the toy. A strange solemnity filled his young face. He nodded. That night, after the boy fled home, the workshop was left in silence. Elias floated within the doll, watching the lamplight flicker across shelves of forgotten toys. He thought of his own life, his wife's laughter, the warmth of his children when they were small, the joy of giving toys to bright-eyed strangers. He thought of how all of it had ended. Confusion, betrayal, the box, the dirt, and then, slowly, he thought no more. The doll shifted on its own, joints creaking as if stretching into new strength. Its legs bent, then straightened. One foot pressed to the bench, then another. Slowly, with effort, it stood. The motion was jerky at first, but steadier with each attempt. It stepped forward, the sound of wood on wood echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet room. It paused before the window. Glass eyes caught the reflection of the street lamp outside, and in that reflection Elias saw was the figure of the doll, upright, alive. The husk in the chair slumped further, chest stilled, forgotten. The doll raised one hand, pressed its palm against the cold glass, and traced invisible letters there. Elias felt each one as though carved into his fading soul. A promise, a vow. I will not be forgotten. Then the lamp sputtered, flared, and went out. Weeks passed. The boy returned with others, curious, wide-eyed. They found the toymaker's body still in his chair, face peaceful, tools scattered where he had left them, and on the bench, they found the doll. It greeted them with tilted head and glassy stare. Some children ran, others stayed, fascinated. They whispered that it moved, that its fingers told stories when no one else was looking. They told their parents, who scoffed, but the tale spread. The doll that spoke, the doll that remembered, the doll that carried a dead man's soul. And so Elias lived on, not in flesh, not in memory of those who had betrayed him, but in the wooden shell of his final creation, his last gift, not for children, not for joy, but for remembrance. And sometimes in the stillness of night, when the workshop was locked and the streets outside lay empty, faint tapping could be heard within, the sound of fingers spelling words no one was there to see. The words of a man who refused to be buried again. Story 6. The Lighthouse Keeper. Not voices, not yet, but of everything else. The ceaseless roar of waves slamming into black stone. The guttural bellow of the foghorn rolling over dark water. The clatter of iron stairs shivering when the wind leaned too hard against the tower's spine. Even at rest, the building seemed alive. At night, when Thomas Hale lay in his narrow bunk, it felt as though the structure itself breathed, groaning with the tide, sighing with the weather, whispering with the sea. He had thought himself prepared. Isolation, he believed, was a skill one could master, like trimming a wick or winding a clock. He had sought this post for its solitude, convinced he wanted distance from the world that had failed him. The keepers before him had vanished into rumor, their names barely recalled in the village 5 miles inland. It did not matter. He was not here to inherit their stories. He was here to escape his own. The tower rose from a knife edge of rock that stabbed into the channel. It was not grand, no whitewashed romance, no postcard image. Its stone was blackened by storms, its lens pitted from years of salt. The stairwell spiraled like a ribcage through the center, its narrow windows admitting only slices of light. From above, the sea stretched infinite, an obsidian plain mottled by white foam. From below, the cliff face fell away into churning depths, where currents gnawed endlessly at the foundation. Thomas settled into routine. He wound the clockwork that rotated the great lens. He polished the glass, oiled the hinges, mended the shutters. The light swept its arc across the water, reliable as breath. Each evening he noted weather and visibility in the logbook, his handwriting neat, precise, the act of recording more important than the content. Structure comforted him, ritual anchored him, but ritual could not mask the unease that grew when night stretched long. The first time he noticed it, he had been half asleep, the foghorn droning low. Beneath the sound came something finer, a murmur too deliberate to be mistaken for wind. He sat upright, listening hard. The sea could mimic, he told himself. Waves in cavern hollows often sounded like voices. Air and shutters could trick the ear. He buried his head in the pillow, forced sleep. But the following night, it came again. This time he was on the lantern deck, polishing the lens. The fog rolled thick, the beam slicing pale corridors through shifting gray. As the light swept, he leaned against the railing, eyes closed. And there it was, a cadence woven into the surf. Not words yet, but rhythm. Rise, fall, pause, repeat, like phrases in a language he had forgotten. He opened his eyes, heart thudding. The sea below boiled with tide, unbroken, empty. Yet the rhythm lingered, threading beneath the surface. By the end of the week, the sound was no longer subtle. It rose when the fog thickened, when the tide swelled, always at night, never in daylight. He began to hear patterns, layers, one tone low and heavy, another lighter, weaving above it. Sometimes he caught what felt like laughter, soft, distant, carried on foam. It was not cruel laughter, but intimate, as though shared between companions. The logbook betrayed him next. One morning he opened it to review his entry from the night before. His neat lines, weather calm, visibility low, lamp steady, were still there. But below them sprawled another phrase, written in the same ink, in his same hand, though he had no memory of forming it. We are waiting. He dropped the pen as though it had burned him. Ink splattered across the page, smudging the words into a dark bruise. The rest of that day he worked feverishly, refusing to stop moving. He wound, polished, scrubbed, anything to stay away from the logbook, the stone walls, the sound that whispered through them. But when night returned, so did the voices. Louder now, closer. He pressed his ear to the wall at the stairwell landing. The stone was cold, damp with salt. And through it he heard not noise, but conversation. Distinct phrases, murmured, layered like overlapping currents. He could not catch every word, but fragments leapt clear. Keeper, watcher, below. He staggered back, clutching the railing. The stone throbbed faintly beneath his palm, as if something vast and living pressed from the other side. He slept little that night. In his half-dreams, he saw figures moving in the water, lanterns bobbing, streets laid out across the seabed, windows glowing in houses that should not exist below the waves. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the roar of surf outside his window indistinguishable from the murmur of voices. By morning he tried to dismiss it. Isolation bred tricks of the mind. Solitude bent sound into shapes. He repeated this to himself as he brewed coffee, as he scribbled in the logbook, as he stared across the horizon. But when evening fell, the whispers began again, and now they spoke not only from the sea, but from inside the tower itself, slipping through cracks in the stone, curling along the spiral stair, soft as breath at his ear. He lit the lamp earlier than usual, flooding the tower with golden glow. Still, the voices did not retreat. They lingered, patient, insistent. Thomas pressed his hands to his ears, shook his head, muttered aloud, "It's only the wind, only the sea." But when he lowered his hands, the voices rose in unison, as if amused by his denial. And this time, he heard them clearly. "Come down." Thomas Hale began to write. At first, it was only to steady himself, to force order into the chaos. He filled pages of the logbook with marks and notations, lines of dashes and dots, crude attempts at phonetics. Each time the voices rose beneath the waves, he strained, pressing his ear to the wall, scribbling what he thought he heard. The pages looked mad, nonsense syllables, looping strokes, scattered notes. But the more he wrote, the more a rhythm emerged. There was pattern. It was not a single voice. It was a chorus. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes they broke apart, each thread weaving into the next. The tones rose and fell like breath, like questions and answers. It was not storm or surf. It was speech. By the end of the week, he could almost follow. One phrase repeated often, always with a low swell beneath it, always in the same cadence. He thought it meant gathering. Another sounded like home, though he could not say why. A lighter voice rose often at dawn, lifting into a trill that reminded him of greetings exchanged across fences. They were not ghosts, not echoes of drowned sailors. They were too steady, too ordinary. What he heard was not wailing, it was conversation. And the realization chilled him more than any haunting could. He tried to dismiss it as madness, solitude bending his mind, but the logbook betrayed him again. Each morning, when he turned back the page to review his notes, he found new lines written in the same ink, sentences curved in his own hand, but he had no memory of forming them. They are not dead. They live below. His pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the desk. He pressed trembling hands to his temples, whispering to himself, "No, no, it isn't possible." But when night fell, the sea answered. He climbed to the lantern room, staring out over the black expanse. The light swept in its steady arc, cutting through fog, and from below rose the cadence clearer, closer, more insistent. He leaned out over the railing, straining. The voices were not lamenting. They were working. He heard the rhythm of trade, bartering tones, the rise of question, the fall of acceptance. He heard what might have been songs, rhythmic chants rising with the tide. He heard laughter warm, familiar as though neighbors greeted each other at the end of a long day. A village, beneath the sea. Impossibly, a village lived. Thomas staggered back, breath ragged. His mind clawed for reason. Sound carried strangely over water. Whales, perhaps. Currents echoing in caverns. But deep inside, he knew. The cadence was too human, too near. Sleep eluded him. When he closed his eyes, images flooded in. Streets paved in shells and sand. Lanterns glowing behind windows of coral. Children's voices ringing out like bells beneath the tide. He woke gasping, salt thick in his mouth, as though he had swallowed the sea. The next morning, the logbook held more words. "They are calling you." Thomas stared at the sentence until his eyes burned. He tore the page out, crumpled it, threw it into the stove. The flames licked it into ash, but when he opened the book again, the words had returned, scrawled across a fresh page. That night, he could not resist. He descended the spiral staircase, each step echoing with dread. At the base of the tower, he opened the iron door and stepped out onto the rocks. The tide was high, waves slamming against stone. Spray soaked his clothes, salt stinging his eyes, and beneath it all, louder than ever, the voices surged. He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against the wet rock. The sound vibrated through bone. Words shaped themselves in his mind, not through understanding but through instinct. He did not translate them, he simply knew. They were inviting him. "Come below." His chest heaved. He stumbled back into the tower, slammed the door, bolted it. He pressed his back against the iron, gasping, trembling. The sound still seeped through, muffled, but insistent. The logbook waited on his desk. He snatched the pen, hand shaking, and scrawled in desperate strokes. "They want me. They are alive. There is a village beneath the waves." The words bled across the page, ink pooling in the fibers. His hand did not stop. Even when his mind screamed to set the pen down, his fingers moved on their own. "They are waiting for me." He dropped the pen, staggered back. The page stared up at him, wet with ink. His chest thundered. Through the stone walls, through the roar of surf, he heard laughter again, warm, welcoming. And for the first time, Thomas felt not fear, but longing. Thomas Hale no longer trusted the boundaries of his own perception. The lighthouse, once a fortress of order and ritual, had begun to shift around him like a living thing, its stone walls absorbing sounds and returning them altered, its stairwell echoing with tones that were not his own footsteps. He kept the lamp trimmed, the lens polished, the foghorn primed. Yet even as he performed these duties, he felt like an actor repeating gestures in a dream, the true work occurring elsewhere, deep in the murmurs that drifted from the sea each night. The logbook had become his enemy and his confessor. He would sit at the desk in the lower chamber, forcing his hand to move in neat, deliberate strokes, recording the weather, the state of the lamp, the time of the tide. For a few moments the ink obeyed. Then, as if the pen were guided by another current, Words emerged that he did not shape. He would watch helplessly as the nib scrawled phrases with his own looping hand. Sentences both intimate and foreign. They spoke of streets paved in coral, of lanterns swaying in currents, of a market where voices rose like gulls. Sometimes the entries named him directly, calling him keeper, and urging him to come below. At first he tore out these pages, fed them to the stove, watched the paper curl and blacken. But each time, the words returned on fresh sheets, written in the same precise script. Soon he stopped resisting and began to read them as one might read letters from a correspondent. The logbook became a window, each page carrying the hum of a village he had never seen, a village that seemed to know him intimately. Sleep no longer offered rest. His dreams filled with images so detailed they could not be inventions. He walked streets lined with driftwood houses, light glowing behind walls of sea glass. He heard footsteps on sand that never shifted beneath his weight. He smelled fires that burned without flame, only a faint shimmer in the water. In these dreams, the villagers turned their heads as he passed, their faces indistinct, yet their gestures warm, their eyes reflecting lamplight from impossible depths. They moved with the ease of those who belong to another element, hair flowing like kelp, voices rising like surf. When he woke, his throat was raw, his lips chapped with salt. More than once he found sand in his sheets, damp patches across the stone floor near his bunk, as if water had seeped in during the night. He tried to convince himself it was leakage from the walls, the perpetual damp of a building lashed by sea and weather. But deep inside he knew that the water came from within him, drawn from the tide of dreams that left him gasping. The voices no longer waited for nightfall. At dawn, when the lamp dimmed and the horizon burned pale, he could still hear them beneath the crash of waves, faint but insistent, like neighbors calling to each other across fences. At midday, when the gulls wheeled overhead, he caught laughter threaded beneath their cries. Even in stillness, the cadence lingered, so constant that silence itself became suspect. The lighthouse was never quiet. It was filled with a conversation that would not end. Thomas began to change his habits. He kept the windows shut tight, yet leaned against them for hours, ear pressed to the glass. He neglected meals, forgetting the bread he had baked or the stew he had simmered. He let the stove grow cold, his body trembling with chill, but his hand scribbled tirelessly, desperate to keep pace with the logbook's unrelenting dictation. The words came faster now, paragraphs spilling across pages, whole stories of feasts held beneath the waves, of rituals timed with the moon, of children chasing each other across the seabed, as if it were a meadow. He read them until his eyes ached, until ink stained his fingertips, and still the sentences multiplied. Sometimes he thought he felt the villagers themselves moving through him, guiding his pen with their own memories. At these times his hand grew steady, his back straight, his breath calm. The fear ebbed, replaced by an aching familiarity, as though he had always known them, as though he belonged not to the lighthouse but to the sea below, and yet part of him resisted. Each evening, when he climbed to the lantern room and watched the beam sweep its arc across the water, he clung to the last semblance of duty. He trimmed the wick, polished the brass, wound the clockwork, and told himself that his purpose was to guide ships, not to surrender to whispers. But even there, in the highest chamber, the voices followed, weaving around the sound of the lens as it turned. One night, as the fog closed thick around the tower, Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass and closed his eyes. The voices swelled beneath him, louder than the surf, clearer than they had ever been. For a moment, they no longer sounded distant. They surrounded him, wrapping his mind in warmth. He felt hands guiding him downstairs, into streets, into homes lit with a glow that did not require fire. He felt the weight of water around him, not suffocating but cradling, as if it were air made heavier, air that belonged to him now. He woke at his desk, the logbook open, his hand stained black. Across the page, sprawled words that struck him like a final chord. "You are already with us." The ink glistened as though still wet. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. He closed the book with trembling hands and staggered to the stairwell, descending to the base of the tower. He flung open the iron door and stepped onto the rocks, salt spray stinging his face. The tide roared high, black water thrashing against the foundation, and beneath the violence of the sea he heard it all. The market, the laughter, The singing, not muffled, not distant, close, immediate. He dropped to his knees, palms pressed flat against the stone, and felt vibrations coursing up his arms like the pulse of some vast, hidden heart. His mind spun, caught between terror and longing, but the longing grew heavier. He wanted to descend, to step off the rock, to let the tide carry him to the place that had called him so long. When he returned inside, his clothes dripping, his hair stiff with salt, the logbook lay waiting. He did not remember opening it, did not remember lifting the pen, yet there on the fresh page gleamed a sentence that curved like a promise. It is time to come home. Thomas closed the book and laid his head upon it, exhausted, heart racing, a hollow ache filling his chest. The sea pressed against the tower, the voices hummed within the stone, and in his half-sleep, he saw lanterns swaying on streets beneath the tide, faces turning toward him with welcome, and though his body trembled with fear, he felt the faintest smile curve across his lips, as if he had already accepted the invitation. The tower no longer felt like a lighthouse. It had become a vessel, hollow and resonant, as if its true purpose were not to shine outward but to draw something inward. Every surface seemed to hum faintly, the stones, the stairwell, even the iron railings. When Thomas placed his palms flat against the wall, he could feel vibration threading through the mortar, a pulse that kept time with neither his own heart nor the sea's rhythm. It was the beat of another world, pressing close from below. He tried to resist through ritual. He trimmed the lamp until its flame burned white and steady. He polished the lens until it shone like a jewel. He wound the clockwork until the gears clicked into their precise order. Yet the tasks gave him no peace. The voices wove through every sound, threading into the clank of metal, the hiss of oil, the scratch of rag against glass. He could not separate them anymore. The logbook had become both a comfort and a torment. By day, he forced himself to write lines in neat hand, weather mild, wind steady, lamp in good order. But when he returned later, fresh sentences appeared beneath them, written in the same ink, in the same script. We sang at dusk. We feasted at the square. The children laughed until the lanterns dimmed. He stared at these lines until his vision swam. He no longer tore them out. He no longer burned them. He simply turned the page and waited for more. At night, he dreamed of breathing water as though it were air. In these dreams, he no longer walked the stone floors of the lighthouse, but wandered avenues lined with coral and shell. He felt hands brush his arm in greeting, saw figures drift past with lanterns swaying in the current, heard songs echo through arches of kelp. When he woke, his lungs burned, his skin damp with brine, his lips crusted with salt. The changes began subtly. His fingernails grew pale, almost translucent. The skin at his temples tingled, as though something beneath it strained for release. He coughed often, a low rasp, but no phlegm came, only a taste of seawater at the back of his throat. He avoided mirrors, yet each time he caught his reflection in the lantern glass, he thought his eyes glimmered faintly, like whetstones catching light. The villagers on the mainland had not visited in weeks. Supplies were delivered once a month, but the sea had grown rough, and no boat had appeared. Thomas no longer cared. The stores in the pantry dwindled, yet he felt little hunger. What filled him now was not food, but the pull of the voices, the steady insistence that grew louder with each tide. He spent long hours on the rocks at the base of the tower, coat whipping in the wind, spray lashing his face. He pressed his ear to the stone until it ached. The words rose clear as bells. Not cries, not moans. Chatter of a village in motion, mothers calling children inside. Merchants hawking wares. Songs drifting from gatherings lit by unseen lanterns. One night, unable to contain himself, he shouted into the surf, voice raw with desperation. "Who are you?" The sea answered with a swell of voices, layered and warm. He could not make out individual phrases, yet their intent struck him like touch. "We are here. We have always been here. We are waiting." He fell to his knees on the slick stone, salt water seeping into his boots, tears mingling with spray. He whispered to the tide, "Why me?" The logbook answered. When he returned inside, shivering, he found the pen lying across the open page. Fresh ink gleamed. "Because you listen." He gripped the desk, knuckles white. His breath rasped, shallow and sharp. He wanted to slam the book shut, to run up the stairwell, to barricade himself in the lantern room. Instead, he touched the words with trembling fingers, tracing each curve as though it were carved into his skin. From that night on, the distinction between dream and waking collapsed. He no longer knew if the markets he wandered, the laughter he heard, the lantern-lit homes he passed were visions in sleep or places he had walked in truth. Once, he awoke at the bottom of the stairwell, clothes dripping, sand clinging to his palms. Another time, he woke in his bunk with seaweed tangled in his hair, the sheets damp and smelling of tide, his body weakened as though hollowed by tides. Yet at the same time, something else grew within him. He felt less bound by the weight of stone and flesh, more attuned to the rhythm below. When he inhaled, the air tasted heavy, mineral-rich, like brine. When he exhaled, he swore he heard faint echoes answer. The lamp itself seemed to conspire. More than once he found it unlit, though he had trimmed it carefully, as if the light no longer belonged to him. Yet ships never struck the rocks. Somehow the sea guided them, whether the lamp turned or not. He began to wonder if his work mattered at all, or if he had been brought here for another purpose entirely. The logbook grew bolder. Sentences no longer described the village below, but gave instructions. Stand at the rocks when the tide is high. Do not fear the water. Breathe. He resisted at first, slamming the book shut, pacing the chamber until sweat soaked his shirt. But when he opened it again, the same lines awaited him, written in patient hand. Breathe. He dreamed of sinking, not drowning, sinking. He felt the water cradle him, hold him as gently as air. He opened his mouth and drew in currents that tasted of salt and iron, yet filled his chest without pain. Figures swam around him, smiling, eyes luminous. They touched his shoulders, his arms, his hair, as though welcoming a lost brother home. When he woke, he coughed violently, brine spilling onto the stone floor. He stared at the shimmering puddle until dawn, body shaking, but inside him something steadied. The sea was no longer an enemy. It was becoming his element. By the end of the month, he ceased recording weather. His logbook filled instead with their words, their rituals, their invitations. His own handwriting blurred into theirs. He no longer knew which lines he had written and which had appeared. The last clear sentence he remembered writing of his own accord read, "I am not alone." After that, the pages belonged to them, and Thomas, though fear gnawed at him still, felt relief, because for the first time since he arrived at the tower, the voices no longer sounded distant. They sounded like family. By the final weeks of his service, Thomas Hale no longer thought of himself as a keeper of light. The tower had become irrelevant, its lens turning whether he wound the gears or not, its flame burning whether he trimmed the wick or let it sputter. Ships passed safely even when the lamp went dark, guided by something deeper than his hands. He had come to realize that the sea itself held its own illumination, a hidden radiance that did not depend on glass or flame. His world had narrowed to two poles, the logbook and the water. Each day he wrote less of weather and more of voices. The script had changed, flowing in long, sweeping lines that no longer resembled his hand, though the pen still lay in his fingers. Sometimes he read the pages and felt they belonged to another era, as if centuries of voices had written through him, preserving their words in ink that bled like salt across the paper. At night, the dreams consumed him. He walked streets paved with sand, beneath arches woven from coral and kelp. He watched children leap through waves as though they were doorways, their laughter rising like bells. He sat at tables carved from driftwood, surrounded by figures who welcomed him with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, eyes that reflected his own. Each dream lingered longer, refusing to fade with dawn. He would wake to find his clothes damp, the taste of brine thick on his tongue, his ears ringing with the murmur of voices as though he had only just surfaced. The changes in his body deepened. His skin held a faint sheen even when dry, as though coated with a thin film of salt. His breathing slowed, shallow but sufficient, as though conserving itself for another element. When he pressed his fingertips to his temples, he swore he felt faint ridges beneath the skin, tender and pulsing. He avoided mirrors, yet each glimpse confirmed what he already knew. His eyes caught the light in ways they had not before, glimmering faintly even in darkness. The logbook's entries grew more insistent. The tide is rising. The village prepares. They wait for you at the square. He read the words with trembling hands, his chest hollow with fear and longing. He wanted to resist, to cling to the tower and the world above, but the pull was relentless. On the final night, The storm came. The sky split with lightning. Waves reared like black walls. The foghorn bellowed until the stone itself shook. Rain hammered against the glass of the lantern room, each drop a drumbeat urging him downward. He climbed the stairwell, every step slick with damp, and stood in the circle of light as it swept across the writhing sea. And beneath the roar of the storm, the voices sang. Not whispers now, not murmurs, but song. A chorus rising from the depths, threaded with welcome, woven with promise. He felt it in his ribs, in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. They were not summoning. They were celebrating. The air itself vibrated with their joy. He staggered down the stairs, lantern swinging in his fist, heart pounding with something that was no longer dread. The iron door at the base of the tower shuddered in the wind. He unbolted it, pushed it open, and the storm hit him full in the face. Salt, spray, thunder. The sea stretched black and endless, lit white for a moment by lightning. And then he saw them. Lanterns. Dozens. Hundreds. Swaying beneath the surface like fireflies suspended in glass. They glowed steadily, forming lines that curved into streets, clustered into squares, flickered like stars that had drowned but never died. Figures moved among them, dark against the light, gestures fluid, arms rising and greeting. The vision stretched as far as he could see, a city breathing beneath the waves. His knees buckled. He fell against the slick rock, tears mixing with rain. The voices swelled, surrounding him. For the first time, he understood every word. Come home, come home, come home. Thomas rose unsteady, the storm whipping his coat against his body. He stepped forward, boots scraping stone, water lapping at his ankles. The tide surged higher, pulling, urging. He did not resist. He waded in, each step deeper, the cold biting at his skin. Lightning flashed above, but his eyes were fixed below, on the lanterns waiting. The sea climbed to his waist, his chest, his throat. He inhaled sharply, certain this would be his last breath. But when the water closed over his head, it was not suffocation that followed. It was release. The salt burned for an instant, then soothed. The weight of the water no longer crushed but cradled. He opened his mouth, and the sea filled him, not drowning, but sustaining, thick and rich as air. His limbs moved with strange ease, propelled not by effort but by belonging. The storm above faded to a dull thrum. Around him the lanterns glowed brighter. Figures approached, their shapes clear at last. Men and women with hair drifting like kelp, eyes gleaming like pearl, their mouths curved in smiles of recognition. One reached for his hand. Their touch was firm, warm despite the cold. He felt his fear dissolve in that gesture. He felt his name dissolve too. The lighthouse behind him receded into darkness, its being lost in rain. The storm raged above, but beneath it lay calm. Streets glowing, voices rising, a village alive. Thomas let himself be led forward, deeper into the light, and when he looked down at his own reflection in the swaying lanterns, he no longer saw a keeper. He saw one of them. The logbook on the desk in the tower remained open, its last page filled in a hand, both his and not his. The ink gleamed, though no lamp burned. The keeper has gone below. The light above is no longer needed. We have our own. Story 7. The Collector of Faces. The mask felt warm in his hands, far too warm for lifeless wood. It seemed to breathe, the hollow eyes watching, the mouth curved in silence. To put it on was not disguise, it was consent. He found it at an auction house tucked between shuttered shops on the edge of the city. The catalog described it plainly. Lot 47, tribal wooden mask, origin uncertain, estimated early 20th century. Yet when Nathan lifted his paddle, when the auctioneer's hammer fell, he swore he heard something else. Not the crack of wood on wood, but a sigh, a quiet, satisfied breath. The mask arrived at his home wrapped in linen, heavier than it looked. Its surface was carved from dark timber, almost black, with deep grooves that caught the light like scars. The eyes were narrow slits, the mouth a thin oval, neither smiling nor frowning, but somehow both. When he traced his fingers over its surface, he felt ridges that seemed too precise for tools, as though they had been grown, not carved. Nathan poured himself a drink, set the mask on his mantle, and studied it. The room felt smaller with it there, as if the air had thickened around it. He told himself that was nonsense, a trick of mood lighting and whiskey. Still, he caught himself glancing at it more often than he meant to, as if expecting its expression to shift when he wasn't looking. That night, he dreamed of faces, not his own, but hundreds of them, blurred and shifting, pressed close together like a crowd in silence. Each turned toward him in unison, mouths opening as if to speak, though no sound came. The only noise was a soft scratching, like wood being carved from within. He woke before dawn, heart hammering, and found the mask where he had left it, though it seemed somehow sharper now, its cheekbones more defined, its lips thinner, as though it had been studying him too. Nathan laughed at himself. Paranoia was unbecoming of a collector. He was a man of taste, not superstition. The mask was simply a masterpiece, and masterpieces always had presence. Still, when he held it up to the mirror and slipped it over his face, he hesitated. The wood was colder than it should have been. Its weight pressed evenly across his skin, hugging too tightly, yet fitting as if it had been made for him. He stared at his reflection, the hollow eyes staring back. The mask's mouth opened slightly with his breath, though there was no hinge, no seam. For a moment, it seemed to inhale with him. When he pulled it off, his skin tingled where the wood had touched. He laughed again, softer this time, but his reflection did not. For a second, just a second, his face in the mirror seemed slower to follow, the corners of his mouth dragging behind the rest of him. He blinked, and it was gone. The mask rested on his desk, silent, expressionless. Yet Nathan could not shake the feeling that, somewhere within the grain of its wood, something had just learned the shape of his face. For the next week, Nathan lived with the mask as one lives with a new guest, pretending it was only an object, while secretly adjusting every movement around its presence. He would pass it on the mantel and feel the pull of its gaze, though its carved eyes never shifted. He would work at his desk and notice his reflection in the dark glass of the window, the mask's shape hovering faintly behind his own. At first, he told himself it was admiration. Collectors were prone to obsession, after all. He had prized artifacts before ancient coins he polished daily, bone carvings he dusted, as though they were fragile children. But this felt different. The mask did not sit passively. It imposed. One evening, Nathan hosted a small gathering. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances from the auction scene. Wine flowed, conversations blurred into laughter, and inevitably, someone noticed the mask. "What is that?" one guest asked, peering at the mantel. "A tribal piece," Nathan said lightly, though his voice carried a note of possession, as if he were speaking not just of an object, but of something alive. "West Africa, I believe. Early 1900 seconds. Remarkable craftsmanship, don't you think?" The group gathered closer. One woman leaned in and frowned. "It looks different," she murmured. "Like it's frowning now." Nathan forced a chuckle. "Lighting plays tricks. It hasn't changed." But when the others laughed and drifted away, Nathan found himself staring hard at the mask. The woman wasn't wrong. The cheekbones had sharpened further. The lips had thinned. The lines of the jaw resembled someone he recognized, his friend Marcus, who had been standing beside it moments earlier. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had fallen quiet, Nathan poured himself another drink and sat across from the mask. He lit no lamps, letting the fireplace cast its uneven glow. The mask seemed fuller now, as though fed by the evening. Its eyes had widened just slightly, enough that it looked less like a relic and more like a face caught mid-expression. He could not ignore the familiarity anymore. The hollows of the cheeks, the curve of the brow. It was Marcus. His heart thudded in unease. Coincidence, he told himself. Projection. He was seeing patterns where none existed. But his hand moved without permission, reaching for it. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, a shiver ran through him. The surface was no longer smooth but ridged, textured with something almost organic. He pulled it free from the mantel and held it close. In the flickering firelight, the carved lips seemed to twitch, parting just enough to hint at breath. Nathan staggered back, pulse quickening, yet he did not drop it. Instead, he lifted it slowly toward his face. The mask slid on as if eager, sealing against his skin with a hiss of warmth. His vision narrowed through the slits, the world dimming at the edges. He stared into the mirror above the fireplace, and what looked back at him was not himself. It was Marcus. Marcus's eyes, Marcus's smile. His features mapped perfectly onto the mask, as though Nathan had vanished behind them. He stumbled back with a strangled cry, tearing the mask away. His chest heaved, sweat prickling across his skin. The reflection snapped back to his own face, pale and wild-eyed. The mask in his hands was calm, expressionless once more. Nathan pressed it to the mantle with shaking fingers, but even as he stepped away, he swore he felt the wood still warm against his palms. His gaze clung to its surface, unable to look elsewhere, and he realized the truth he did not want to name aloud. The mask was not preserving its shape. It was collecting, and Marcus's face was only the first. The nights after the gathering blurred into one another. Nathan told himself he would leave the mask alone, that it was only an object, but his resolve weakened each evening. The townhouse grew quieter around it, every clock tick and floorboard groan somehow pointing him back toward the mantel where it sat in silence. At first, it was curiosity that drew him, then unease, then finally compulsion. When his friends visited, he watched them more carefully than before. Over dinner, over wine, as laughter rose and fell, Nathan noticed their eyes drifting toward the mask as though drawn unconsciously. Some remarked on it, others ignored it, but all seemed unsettled by its presence. And afterward, always afterward, when the house was quiet again, the mask was different. One night it carried the softened jawline of Clara, who had leaned too close in fascination. Another, the sloped brow of Edmund, who had scoffed and declared it grotesque. Each time, the change was subtle, like a sketch refined between sittings, but Nathan could see it. He knew the contours of their faces well enough to recognize them carved in the grain. He began testing it. At parties, he left the mask visible, watching who approached, who dared to touch it, who lingered in conversation beside it. And each time, afterward, the wood grew sharper, fuller, as though it had fed. But what unsettled him most wasn't what appeared on the mask. It was what disappeared from them. Clara, usually quick with wit, had seemed vague the next time he saw her, as though distracted by something she could not name. Edmund's booming laugh had thinned, his smile brittle, his eyes hollow. Others followed the same pattern, energy fading, expression slackening, as if some vital spark had been drained. Nathan told himself it was coincidence, stress, the natural wear of life. Yet when he looked at the mask, there was no denying what he saw. Their vitality, their essence, had been absorbed, etched into the wood grain. One evening, unable to resist, he lifted the mask again. His reflection in the hallway mirror warped once more. Dozens of faces stared back at him in layers. Clara, Edmund, Marcus, others half-formed, sliding across his own features like oil on water. He ripped it off with a choked gasp, nearly dropping it. The wood burned against his palms now, alive with warmth. For the first time, he wondered if the mask could ever be satisfied, or if it was only growing hungrier with each new face it claimed. That night, Nathan dreamed again. He stood in a hall lined with mirrors, but none reflected his true self. Each glass carried the face of someone he knew, friends, colleagues, strangers glimpsed at cafes, all gazing out with empty eyes. Their mouths opened, and in unison they whispered, "Give it back." He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, but the whisper had not ended with the dream. It lingered, low and steady, and when he turned toward the mantel, he saw the mask's carved mouth stretched wider than before, almost as if it had spoken. Nathan pressed a trembling hand to his own face, desperate to feel his own features still intact. They were there, but beneath his fingers, he swore he felt the faint vibration of wood. The nights after the gathering blurred into one another. Nathan told himself he would leave the mask alone, that it was only an object, but his resolve weakened each evening. The townhouse grew quieter around it, every clock tick and floorboard groan somehow pointing him back toward the mantel where it sat in silence. At first, it was curiosity that drew him, then unease, then finally, compulsion. When his friends visited, he watched them more carefully than before. Over dinner, over wine, as laughter rose and fell, Nathan noticed their eyes drifting toward the mask as though drawn unconsciously. Some remarked on it, others ignored it, but all seemed unsettled by its presence. And afterward, always afterward, when the house was quiet again, the mask was different. One night it carried the softened jawline of Clara, who had leaned too close in fascination. Another, the sloped brow of Edmund, who had scoffed and declared it grotesque. Each time the change was subtle, like a sketch refined between sittings. but Nathan could see it. He knew the contours of their faces well enough to recognize them carved in the grain. He began testing it. At parties, he left the mask visible, watching who approached, who dared to touch it, who lingered in conversation beside it. And each time, afterward, the wood grew sharper, fuller, as though it had fed. But what unsettled him most wasn't what appeared on the mask. It was what disappeared from them. Clara, usually quick with wit, had seemed vague the next time he saw her, as though distracted by something she could not name. Her smile was slower. Her stories faltered mid-sentence. Edmund's booming laugh had thinned, his smile brittle, his eyes hollow. Others followed the same pattern, energy fading, expression slackening, as if some vital spark had been drained. Nathan told himself it was coincidence, stress, the natural wear of life. Yet when he looked at the mask, there was no denying what he saw. Their vitality, their essence, had been absorbed, etched into the wood grain. The collector in him warred with something deeper. Part of him was horrified, another part entranced. What was an artifact, after all, but a container of history, of people, of lives? Perhaps this mask was the ultimate artifact, an object that did not merely preserve culture but consumed it. He began to notice smaller changes. Each morning when he woke, he found the mask not quite where he had left it, sometimes tilted on the mantel, sometimes resting a fraction closer to the edge. Once, disturbingly, it lay flat on his desk, as though placed carefully for him to find. He lived alone. No one else had touched it. One evening he tried to lock it away. He set it in a wooden chest lined with cloth, closed the latch, and left it in the attic. The act gave him relief for a single night. But the next morning, when he descended to his study, the mask was waiting again on the mantel, its eyes angled toward his chair. Sleep abandoned him. Each night he dreamed of faces, hundreds of them, some familiar, some strangers, all pressed together like a gallery of lost portraits. Their mouths opened soundlessly, but the silence was worse than any scream. He would wake with his heart hammering, only to find the mask angled just enough that the firelight caught its cheekbones that seemed to multiply, overlapping like layers of skin. One night, unable to resist, he lifted the mask again. His reflection in the hallway mirror warped once more. Dozens of faces stared back at him in layers. Clara, Edmund, Marcus, others half-formed, sliding across his own features like oil on water. He ripped it off with a choked gasp, nearly dropping it. The wood burned against his palms now, alive with warmth. He could almost swear he felt something shift beneath the surface, as though the mask contained muscles waiting to flex. And then the whispering began. At first he thought it was the house settling, pipes sighing in the walls. But as he held the mask close, the sound clarified. Dozens of voices, muffled as though speaking through thick wood, murmured just beyond the grain. He couldn't distinguish the words, but the cadence was unmistakable, pleading, begging. He pressed the mask against the desk with shaking hands, his heart racing. The voices quieted instantly, smothered into silence. But when he drew back, when he dared lift it again, the murmurs swelled as though eager, straining to be heard. For the first time, Nathan wondered if the mask could ever be satisfied, or if it was only growing hungrier with each new face it claimed. That night, Nathan dreamed again. He stood in a hall lined with mirrors, but none reflected his true self. Each glass carried the face of someone he knew, friends, colleagues, strangers glimpsed at cafes, all gazing out with empty eyes. Their mouths opened, and in unison they whispered, "Give it back." He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, but the whisper had not ended with the dream. It lingered, low and steady, and when he turned toward the mantel, he saw the mask's carved mouth stretched wider than before, almost as if it had spoken. Nathan pressed a trembling hand to his own face, desperate to feel his own features still intact. They were there, but beneath his fingers, he swore he felt the faint vibration of wood. Nathan's townhouse had never felt so cavernous, nor so suffocating. The mask sat on the mantel as always, but it was no longer subtle in its theft. He could see the shifts in broad strokes now, lines carved deep into the cheeks, a curl to the lips, eyelids narrowing into something undeniably human. It no longer looked like a relic. It looked like a portrait, and he knew exactly whose portrait it was. Marcus had come by that afternoon, his oldest friend, the one who had humored Nathan's obsessions for years. They had shared a bottle of wine, though Marcus drank little, his attention drifting often to the mask. He had laughed at first, joking that Nathan's creepy toy belonged in a horror film, but by the end of the evening his laughter had thinned, his words faltered, his face seemed slack, as though sleep tugged at him from inside. Nathan had walked him to the door, and in that moment, Marcus looked at him with an expression Nathan could not forget: blank, distant. A man emptied of himself. Now, hours later, the mask bore that same emptiness. It was Marcus's face, not an imitation, not a resemblance. It was exact, the familiar angle of the jaw, the dimple at the corner of his mouth, the faint scar near the temple, all of it captured in wood, rendered with a perfection no artisan could achieve. Nathan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His hands trembled as he clutched the armrest of his chair, forcing himself not to look, but his gaze returned again and again, drawn to the hollow eyes that were once Marcus's. Desperation clawed at him. He dialed Marcus's number, pressed the phone to his ear. The line rang. Once, twice, then silence. "Marcus," he whispered, voice cracking. There was no reply. Only the faintest of sounds, like wood scraping softly, rhythmically, as if something were carving itself on the other end. Nathan dropped the phone, heart pounding, and turned back toward the mantel. The mask's lips had shifted, just slightly, but enough that he could see teeth now carved with painstaking precision, grinning faintly, cruelly. "No," Nathan muttered, stumbling forward. "This isn't real. This isn't..." But when he reached for it, the wood burned hot under his fingers, pulsing as though blood flowed beneath its surface. He snatched his hand back, staring at the reddened skin on his palm. The whispers began again, not muffled this time, clear. Dozens of voices poured from the mask's mouth, layered and pleading, each one a fragment of someone lost. And beneath them all, one voice rose higher, familiar, anguished. "Marcus, give it back." Nathan fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but the sound was inside him now. It echoed in his skull, vibrating against his teeth. He sobbed, shaking his head, unable to drown it out. The mask loomed above him on the mantel, its eyes no longer hollow but filled with depthwood darkening to resemble flesh, glistening as though wet. He knew then that Marcus was gone, not absent, not missing, but consumed. The mask had taken not only his face but his essence, leaving behind nothing more than a husk that had walked out Nathan's door earlier, a shell that no longer belonged to his friend. Nathan's collector's mind fractured between horror and awe. He was staring at the very thing all collectors crave, an object that does not simply hold history, but devours it, absorbs it, becomes it. It was ultimate preservation at the cost of life itself. And he, Nathan, had been the one to feed it. Nathan did not remember when night turned to dawn, or dawn back to night. Time bled around him, smothered by the mask's presence. He had tried to leave, but each time his hand touched the doorknob of his townhouse, his body froze. The mask called to him without sound, drawing him back with invisible threads. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He sat in the armchair opposite the mantel, watching. The mask no longer hid its transformations. Its surface shifted like water caught in slow motion, features sliding beneath the grain. Marcus, Clara, Edmund. Others he could not name, all their faces flickered across the wood, merging and separating, until the mask no longer resembled any one person but a composite of many. And in those moments, Nathan swore it turned toward him, not in angle or placement, but in intent, its hollow eyes fixed on him alone, waiting. The whispers grew louder. They no longer begged for release. They accused. They called his name, over and over, until his own sense of identity began to unravel beneath the chorus. "Nathan, Nathan, Nathan." He pressed his palms against his ears until they bled, but the voices vibrated in his bones. He screamed at the mask, hurled curses, begged it to stop, but each sound he made was swallowed and returned to him, echoed in different voices: Clara's, Marcus's, Edmund's, until he could no longer tell which voice was his own. And then, one night, the mask was no longer on the mantel. It was in his hands. He did not remember picking it up. His fingers trembled, but they clung tightly to the edges, knuckles white, as though the mask had been passed to him in ritual. The wood was warm, too warm. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat against his skin. "No," Nathan whispered, tears streaking his cheeks. "Not me. I'm not yours." But the mask disagreed. The voices surged, no longer whispers but wails, 1,000 throats shrieking from within the wood. And beneath them all, Marcus's voice cut through. "Join us." Nathan stumbled backward, but his hands betrayed him. The mask rose of its own accord, aligning with his face. He fought, straining every muscle, but his arms moved steadily, inexorably, lifting the hollow eyes to meet his own. The moment the wood touched his skin, it clamped down. There was no seam, no space to breathe. The mask sealed itself with a sound like splitting bark, fusing against him. Nathan clawed at it, nails tearing against the ridges, but it would not come away. His scream was muffled, twisted, reshaped into the chorus already inside. The townhouse trembled with the sound, hundreds of voices erupting at once, layered in agony, in hunger, in despair. His own voice threaded into them seamlessly, indistinguishable from Marcus, from Clara, from all the others. In the mirror above the fireplace, he saw his final reflection. Not Nathan, a shifting amalgamation of faces, sliding and melting into one another, eyes hollow, mouths opening and closing in silent cries. His body staggered forward, hands dropping uselessly to his sides. The mask had become his face, and his face had become one of many. The whispers quieted at last. The mask smiled, and deep within the wood, if one listened closely, a new voice had joined the chorus, rasping, pleading, barely audible beneath the others. Nathan's. And so, the night grows long, and the voices of our stories have folded themselves back into the dark. 7 tales carried on the wind, drawn from ruins, from water, from stone, from memory, each one a thread in the same tapestry of silence that waits just outside your window. Perhaps, as you lie there now, listening, you'll notice the faintest echo that doesn't quite belong to your room, a laugh that isn't yours, a whisper that lingers just a heartbeat too long, a voice that feels as though it knows your name. If you do, don't lean too close. Some things are better left unheard. But then again, you came here tonight because you wanted to hear. You wanted to follow the rhythm of the stories, to let them seep into your bones and drift with you into sleep. Sleep, or something that only looks like it. This has been your companion in the midnight hours, guiding you through echoes, faces, waters, and shadows. If you've made it this far, you are already part of the circle, one more listener sitting close to the fire that never goes out. I'll leave the lamp burning, just dim enough to keep the dark company. And when you return, there will be more waiting for you. More stories that don't end. Only rest until you're ready to wake them again. Until next time, good night.